What if the very stones of Easter Island could speak? What if the silent faces of the Moai, with their hollow eyes gazing endlessly toward the horizon, were not only monuments of stone, but voices carved into the earth, attempting to tell us a story that stretches across time, across oceans, and perhaps across civilizations? The first question, and perhaps the most haunting, is not why they were built, but how. How did a people isolated on one of the most remote islands in the world, with no access to metal, wheels, or draft animals, raise nearly 900 colossal statues, some weighing more than 80 tons, and move them across rugged volcanic terrain? It is a riddle that has captured explorers, archaeologists, dreamers, and conspiracy theorists alike. The islanders called them walking statues. Legends whispered that the Moai were animated by a sacred power, a spiritual force known as mana. According to oral histories, they did not drag the statues. No, the Moai themselves walked, rocking from side to side like great stone beings making their way toward the edges of the island. Was this metaphor, myth, or memory of an ingenious technique that we have only begun to rediscover? Archaeologists today experiment with ropes and leverage, finding that indeed, with coordinated effort, the massive figures can be tilted and rocked, almost as if alive. Could it be that the myth was never metaphor at all, but a direct recollection of how these statues really moved? Imagine the sheer intensity of effort required. A community investing years into carving, shaping, smoothing volcanic tuff from the quarry of Rano Raraku. Every chisel mark etched with stone tools alone, every groove, every feature refined without metal. Then came the transportation. Kilometers of movement through uneven terrain, dense vegetation, and steep slopes. This was no small act of engineering. It was a ritual of endurance, a unifying labor that demanded collective devotion. These people were not simply carving stone. They were carving identity, weaving their belief systems and cosmology into a physical form that could endure storms, famines, and the fading of memory. But why such obsession? Why statues so large that they strained the very limits of possibility? Perhaps in pushing beyond what seemed humanly achievable, the Rapa Nui were declaring their existence to the cosmos, inscribing their survival into monuments that outlived storms, famines, and collapse. Yet, in their ambition, they may also have courted ruin. Theories suggest that the relentless demand for timber, rope, and labor to transport the Moai contributed to the deforestation of the island. Trees felled for rollers or ropes may have stripped the ecosystem bare, leaving the soil vulnerable to erosion, crops harder to grow, and society strained by scarcity. And yet, the Moai remained standing, defiant, as if mocking our neat narratives of collapse, as if whispering that the truth of their creation and their cost is more complicated than we can measure. And still the Moai remain, as if mocking our attempts to simplify their mystery. For centuries, Western explorers arriving at the island saw only ruin and asked, how could these primitive people have achieved this? But the question is not about primitivism, it is about ingenuity. The Rapa Nui were not helpless. They were masters of stone and leverage, visionaries who commanded physics through persistence. Their techniques may not have required wheels or animals, but rather the will of hundreds moving in harmony, their songs and chants binding human muscle into living machines of belief. Think of the roads that stretch like veins across the island, leading outward from the quarry like purposeful pathways. These are not random tracks. They are ceremonial avenues, aligned with meaning, with direction. Some suggest they were built not only for utility, but for ritual journeys, each statue embodying an ancestor's spirit, each transported Moai a rebirth of lineage carried from the quarry to its platform, or ahu. And when placed upon these platforms, facing inward toward the villages, the Moai became guardians, eternal witnesses of the community, embodiments of protection and continuity. And yet, the mystery deepens when one realizes that Easter Island was not alone in this tradition. Across the globe, ancient cultures moved impossible stones, from the trilithons of Stonehenge to the obelisks of Egypt, from the megaliths of Malta to the statues of Nemrut in Turkey. Humans have again and again defied the limits of transport and construction. Was this coincidence, or was there once a shared knowledge, a lost science of megalithic movement that stretched across oceans and generations? The Moai of Easter Island are part of this greater puzzle, an echo in stone of a worldwide phenomenon that suggests humanity's hunger to leave enduring marks upon the earth. Some have gone further, weaving theories of contact, suggesting that the Polynesian navigators who reached Rapa Nui carried with them not only the art of sailing, but fragments of knowledge from distant lands, carried across the waves like seeds of civilization. Others whisper of something stranger still, of global networks, of forgotten connections between far-flung cultures, of the possibility that the Moai were nodes in a system of symbols that spanned the world. Were they signposts, messages, or anchors aligned with stars, communicating with distant observers? The theories veer into the realm of speculation, yet they reveal something crucial. The Moai are not only about engineering, they are about meaning, and meaning always stretches further than stone. But return for a moment to the quarry itself. Walk among the half-carved statues still embedded in the slopes of Rano Raraku. Here, time feels frozen, as if the workers dropped their tools and never returned. Why were these Moai abandoned? Was it a sudden collapse, a catastrophe, or a shift in faith? Some statues stand buried up to their shoulders, their hidden bodies stretching downward beneath the earth, suggesting that the process was far more complex than the surface reveals. We often think of them as heads alone, but in truth, they are entire beings, standing tall beneath the soil, unseen yet intact. Consider also the platforms themselves. The ahu were feats of precision engineering, their stones fitted without mortar, their alignments often celestial. To lift and place a Moai onto such a platform required not only raw strength, but technical mastery. Did they use ramps, scaffolds, or lever systems? Every theory carries strengths and flaws, but the truth remains elusive. And in that elusiveness lies the allure. The Moai are not merely archaeological puzzles, but mirrors of our own desire to know, to reach into mystery and wrestle meaning from silence. There is also the psychological dimension. Imagine being a villager watching the Moai walk toward your community, looming larger with every step, a colossal ancestor returning from the quarry to watch over you. This was theater, ritual, and cosmic drama. The act of transportation was not a burden alone. It was a spectacle of faith, a reaffirmation that the ancestors still lived through stone, that the community was bound together through shared labor, shared suffering, and shared awe. And here we return to the haunting question. Did the Moai truly walk? Or have we, in our search for rational explanations, overlooked something more profound? Some claim that sound, vibration, or even forgotten forms of technology might have been involved. Such ideas blur the line between archaeology and myth, yet they echo a deeper truth. The Moai are mysteries precisely because they inhabit the threshold between human ingenuity and the impossible. They remind us that the limits we imagine are often limits of imagination itself. What then does the mystery of transportation and construction truly reveal? Not only that humans are capable of astonishing feats, but that these feats are born from vision, faith, and unity. The Moai are not just stones. They are testaments to a people who refuse to be small, even upon the smallest of islands. They are echoes of a civilization that sought to carve permanence into impermanence, to defy isolation with monuments that could not be ignored. And perhaps this is why their mystery endures. For every explanation we propose, sledges, ropes, walking statues, there remains a residue of wonder, an aftertaste of the impossible. The Moai invite us not only to analyze but to imagine, not only to measure but to marvel. They challenge us to ask, what are we building today that will astonish those who come after us? What monuments are we leaving, of stone, of steel, of digital code, that will stand as our Moai? Will they look back at us with the same silent, haunting eyes, asking how we did it and why? The stones of Easter Island keep their silence, and perhaps that is the final lesson, that the mystery of transportation and construction is not meant to be solved entirely. It is meant to remind us that some truths are lived, not explained. Some achievements are felt, not dissected. The Moai stand because their makers believed they must, and in that belief, they transcended their limits. In that belief, they walked. Yet, the more we study, the more layers of mystery unfold. Consider the physics experiments where researchers tie ropes to the heads of replica Moai and rock them forward like pendulums. With enough people and careful rhythm, the statue begins to stride, each sway advancing it step by step. This discovery lends weight to the oral tradition of walking statues. And yet, even this experiment leaves gaps. How did they stabilize statues on steep slopes? How did they prevent the brittle volcanic stone from shattering under stress? Such questions remind us that ancient solutions may have been far more refined than the simple models we recreate today. We must also not forget the role of sound, song, and rhythm. Work songs, chants, and ritual performances may have helped coordinate hundreds of laborers, aligning their strength in perfect synchrony. This is not mere logistics. It is culture turned into engineering. The Rapa Nui did not separate labor from spirituality. The act of building was itself an offering, a continuous dialogue with their gods and ancestors. When one observes the Moai, half buried with only heads visible, a haunting realization emerges. Most of these giants have full torsos, arms, and inscriptions hidden beneath the soil. Their burial was not deliberate. It was time, erosion, and shifting earth that swallowed them. The builders invested not only in size but in detail, in carvings that were never meant to be hidden. Why craft such intricacies unless they believed the very earth itself was watching? Unless they saw permanence not in the visible alone, but in what was entrusted to the ground? Other parallels emerge in the world. Think of the colossal statues of Mount Nemrut in Turkey, their heads toppled yet still conveying an aura of divine kingship. Or the unfinished obelisk of Aswan in Egypt, still lying in its quarry, cracked but intact, a frozen moment of ambition. Easter Island's half-carved Moai echo these unfinished works, suggesting that abandonment is also part of the human story. Civilizations dream, attempt, strain against their limits, and sometimes fail. But even in failure, they leave monuments of wonder, testaments to the scale of their dreams. And perhaps there is a lesson hidden here for us. Our skyscrapers, satellites, and machines are our own Moai. They too demand collective effort, coordination, and sacrifice. They too may one day be ruins that puzzle future generations. The Rapa Nui whisper to us across centuries, build not only for utility, but for meaning. Build not only to survive, but to tell your story to the universe. In every stone lifted, in every Moai that walked, they inscribed their defiance of smallness, their refusal to be forgotten. Beneath the surface of Easter Island, where the windswept plains meet the silence of the Pacific, lies another layer of mystery. For centuries, visitors gazed upon the Moai and saw only heads, half buried, their solemn faces staring skyward. It became a global assumption that these were statues of heads alone, strange sentinels of stone rising from the ground like unfinished thoughts. But the earth keeps secrets, and in the act of excavation, archaeologists discovered something astonishing. Beneath the soil, hidden torsos stretched downwards, arms carved against bodies, inscriptions etched into stone that had not seen the light of day for centuries. The Moai were never just heads. They were whole beings, their lower halves swallowed by time, by erosion, by shifting ground. And with this discovery came new questions. If the statues were buried so deeply, what else might rest beneath them? Whispers began of chambers, tunnels, and underground spaces hidden beneath the platforms on which the Moai stand. The ahu, those ceremonial platforms of cut stone, are not simply pedestals. They are constructions of engineering and meaning, housing burial sites, caches of offerings, sometimes even human remains. Dig into an ahu, and you do not find empty soil, but complex arrangements of stones, chambers that once held the bones of chiefs and priests. It is here, in these dark spaces beneath the statues, that we glimpse another layer of the Rapa Nui belief system. The Moai were not only guardians of the living, they were watchmen for the dead, standing above the very bones of ancestors, marking a union of earth, stone, and spirit. Imagine stepping into one of these underground chambers. The air is still, cool and heavy with the weight of centuries. The stones fit so tightly that not even a blade of grass can slip between them. Some walls are etched with petroglyphs, birds, waves, eyes that seem to follow you as you move. These carvings are not random decoration, they are invocations, echoes of a cosmology in which every surface of stone was alive with meaning. The chamber is not only a tomb, but a message written in darkness, intended for gods, spirits, and perhaps for us. What would it mean if every Moai was rooted not just in earth, but in architecture? If every statue was the visible tip of a hidden complex? Some researchers suggest that beneath certain platforms there are labyrinthine tunnels, lava tubes repurposed as sacred passageways. Easter Island is volcanic, riddled with underground conduits formed by rivers of fire that cooled and hardened into caverns. The Rapa Nui knew these features intimately. Some lava tubes extend for kilometers, forming natural caves with ceilings of basalt. Archaeologists have found signs of occupation inside these caves: stone hearths, pigments for painting, even skeletal remains. In the absence of trees, caves became homes, workshops, sanctuaries. And so, the question arises, were the Moai, towering above the surface, intentionally linked to these underground spaces? Were the statues not only guardians of villages, but markers of entrances into a hidden world below? Legends among the Rapa Nui speak of spirits moving through the earth, of the dead returning in dreams, of mana flowing through stone and soil alike. To them, the ground was not inert. It was alive, a medium between the human and the divine. If the Moai embodied the ancestors above ground, the chambers beneath may have embodied their passage into the unseen. Together they formed a vertical axis, stone faces gazing outward toward the horizon, and hidden chambers anchoring them into the womb of the earth. The visible and the invisible united in one architectural gesture. Consider the psychological impact of this design. A villager approaches the Ahu. He sees the towering Moai, its face a constant reminder of ancestral authority. He knows that beneath the platform, in darkness, lie the bones of those who came before him. Every offering placed at the base, every ritual performed, is amplified by this awareness. Above him, the stone ancestor watches. Beneath him, the bones of the dead rest. He stands between them, a living bridge in a continuum of lineage. In such a place, one does not feel alone. One feels encompassed, embraced, and judged all at once. Yet the mystery deepens. Some theorists propose that the underground chambers were not only tombs, but parts of a larger symbolic network. The platforms may have been constructed to align with celestial events, solstices, equinoxes, positions of the stars, and the chambers beneath might have served as ritual observatories, places where priests entered darkness to commune with gods, only to emerge beneath the looming faces of stone. What if the Moai above were meant to receive the sky, while the chambers below absorbed the secrets of the underworld? Together they would form a cosmic axis, an architecture of connection that bridged heaven, earth, and underworld. The discovery of carvings beneath the soil reinforces this possibility. Some of the buried torsos of Moai are inscribed with petroglyphs, patterns of birds, fish, and celestial forms. Why carve what no one would see, unless those carvings were intended for spirits within the earth? Unless, perhaps, the act of carving itself was communication, a dialogue between the carver and the hidden world. We like to think of art as made for the eye, but here art was made for the unseen, for the silence of soil, for watchers who do not dwell in sunlight. The global parallels are irresistible. Think of the pyramids of Egypt, their monumental facades concealing labyrinths of tunnels, chambers, and hidden passages. Think of the Mayan temples, their altars standing above crypts where rulers lay entombed, their staircases descending into caverns painted with glyphs. Across the world, cultures created monuments that combined surface spectacle with subterranean mystery. Easter Island fits into this global pattern, suggesting that the impulse to merge visible and invisible worlds was universal. The Moai were not isolated oddities. They were nodes in a larger human tradition of building upwards and downwards at once. And yet, unlike the pyramids, unlike the temples, Easter Island's monuments remain shrouded in silence. Excavations are limited, restricted by the need to preserve fragile structures. Much of what lies beneath remains unexplored. Ground-penetrating radar suggests anomalies, voids beneath certain platforms, but definitive answers are scarce. We are left with tantalizing fragments, bones, carvings, tunnels half-mapped. And so, the imagination fills the void. What if beneath every Moai there are chambers as yet untouched, libraries of stone preserving knowledge, rituals, stories that the surface alone cannot tell? The Rapa Nui today still live in the presence of these mysteries. For them, the Moai are not relics, but ancestors. The underground chambers are sacred, places not only of archaeology, but of continuity. To disturb them is to trespass on living memory. And so, we tread lightly, balancing curiosity with respect. In this balance lies another lesson, that not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some are meant to be honored, to be carried forward as enigmas that enrich rather than diminish our sense of wonder. What then does the enigma of the underground chambers reveal? That the Moai were not solitary figures, but the tips of vast unseen roots. That to understand them, one must look not only at what rises, but at what sinks, not only at what is lit by the sun, but what is cloaked in the dark. The mystery of transportation and construction teaches us about human ingenuity. The mystery of underground chambers teaches us about human depth, the willingness to weave death, ancestry, and cosmos into a single sacred architecture. And perhaps this is the greatest revelation, that beneath every statue lies another statue, invisible, not of stone, but of absence, of hollow spaces carved into the world as deliberately as the Moai were carved from volcanic tuff. These voids are not empty. They are full of presence, of silence that speaks louder than words. The Moai look outward, but their roots look inward. Together they form a dialogue between what is shown and what is hidden, between the face of eternity and the chamber of memory. One day, perhaps, technology will allow us to see further beneath without disturbance. We may map every chamber, trace every tunnel, uncover every hidden carving. But even then, the deeper mystery will remain. Why? Why did the Rapa Nui bury so much of their art, hide so much of their meaning, and trust so much to the earth? Perhaps they knew that mystery itself is sacred, that the act of concealment can be as powerful as the act of revelation. And so the Moai remain, their faces exposed, their bodies buried, their chambers sealed. They are half gift and half riddle, half answer and half silence. To sky, to earth, and to underworld. This triad of realms is a pattern repeated across ancient cosmologies. In Norse myth, Yggdrasil the world tree connects the heavens, the human world, and the roots of the dead. In Mesoamerican cosmology, pyramids and caves form sacred axes, binding sunlit temples to cavernous underworlds. The Moai, standing above buried chambers, may represent the Rapa Nui expression of this universal human vision, that life is suspended between forces above and below, and monuments must embody both directions. Archaeological surveys with ground-penetrating radar have suggested voids beneath certain ahu, some extending further than the visible platform stones. Researchers debate whether these anomalies are natural lava tubes, adapted by human hands, or deliberately constructed chambers, perhaps to store bones, relics, or ritual objects. If true, each Moai would be less an isolated statue and more a marker stone, an index pointing downward to spaces of memory. The statue would be the voice, the chamber, the archive. The spiritual symbolism of descent cannot be overstated. Across cultures, going underground was synonymous with entering mystery, dying to one state of being and awakening to another. In rites of passage, initiates often entered caves, tunnels, or artificially darkened rooms. Emerging back into daylight was symbolic rebirth. Could it be that the chambers beneath the Moai were stages for such initiations? That the youth of Rapa Nui passed through these shadows, guided by chance, emerging beneath the watchful gaze of stone ancestors, forever transformed? There are also legends on the island of Hiva, the mythical homeland from which the Rapa Nui came. Some oral traditions claim that the first settlers emerged from a cave after their arrival, as though the island itself gave birth to them. In this context, caves are not prisons, but wombs. To place statues above such womb-like chambers would be to consecrate birth and death together, to fuse the origins of the people with the guardianship of their ancestors. Think of the psychological impact on daily life. A farmer walking past the Moai knows that beneath its feet lie the bones of chiefs. A child raised in its shadow knows that her prayers sink into chambers beneath, absorbed by stone and bone alike. Every feast, every ritual, every song performed at the platform is layered with the invisible presence of the underground. To live on Rapa Nui was to live between two worlds constantly, never free of the gaze above or the silence below. And then comes the question of secrecy. Underground chambers are not visible to outsiders. They are known to initiates, guarded by the community, hidden from casual eyes. They create an architecture of exclusivity, dividing those who know from those who guess. In this sense, the Moai are both public and private, giants that anyone can see, rooted in mysteries only the few may enter. Such duality may have been part of their power. The Rapa Nui leaders controlled not only the visible spectacle of stone statues, but the invisible rituals beneath, wielding control over both worlds. There is also speculation of alignment. Some platforms with subterranean chambers face significant astronomical directions, solstices, equinoxes, or the rising of important stars like Sirius or Aldebaran. If true, the underground spaces may have been observatories of darkness, where light entered only during specific celestial events, piercing chambers with beams of meaning. Imagine a priest waiting in shadow for a shaft of starlight to strike an altar deep within a chamber, confirming the calendar, affirming the connection between sky and earth. In this vision, the Moai above is the watcher of the stars, while the chamber below is the receiver of their hidden rhythms. And still, beneath all speculation lies the raw fact. Much remains unexcavated. The soil hides secrets we may never fully uncover, either because preservation demands restraint, or because the Rapa Nui themselves wish the silence kept. What lies beneath may be bones, may be offerings, may be nothing but volcanic stone. But the very possibility that something is there transforms the statues into thresholds. They are not only what they show, they are what they suggest, what they conceal. When we consider global patterns, the comparison grows even richer. In Malta, the Hypogeum of Halsaflieni is an underground sanctuary carved into limestone, where echoes amplify voices into otherworldly tones. In Cappadocia, entire underground cities stretch beneath the earth, hiding thousands. In Mesoamerica, caves were revered as entrances to Xibalba, the Mayan underworld, where rituals of blood and fire honored gods. The Rapa Nui, in their isolated oceanic world, created their own expression of this pattern, linking massive statues above with chambers below, combining visibility and invisibility into one sacred unity. Perhaps the final mystery is this. What if the underground chambers were never meant to be uncovered? What if their very secrecy is the essence of their meaning? The Moai above invite endless study, photographs, and theories, but the chambers below resist exposure. They remain dark, concealed, untouched. And perhaps this is deliberate. Perhaps the Rapa Nui intended that part of their world always remain hidden, so that wonder itself would never be exhausted. In that way, the Moai and their chambers continue to live, feeding not only the island's heritage, but the imagination of all who encounter them. To stand before a Moai today is to face more than stone. It is to sense the weight of everything beneath, the invisible foundations that anchor memory into earth. The chamber is unseen, but you feel it. The silence beneath the statue deepens the gaze above. Together they create a presence that is almost unbearable in its gravity. And as you walk away, you carry with you not just the image of a face, but the haunting thought of what lies hidden below, a presence you will never see, yet can never forget. What if the Moai of Easter Island were not isolated monuments at all, but participants in a vast invisible dialogue? What if their silent eyes, their rigid postures, their very placement upon the earth were not merely symbolic, but functional, antennas of stone tuned to forces we barely comprehend? Across the globe, ancient civilizations raised megaliths, obelisks, and pyramids with obsessive precision, aligning them with stars, solstices, magnetic fields, and one another. Could it be that Easter Island's Moai were not only guardians of the Rapa Nui, but nodes in a larger network of energy transmission, stretching from continent to continent, binding humanity in ways science has not yet dared to measure? Legends from the island whisper of mana, a spiritual power that animated not only the statues, but the very land itself. Mana was not abstract, it was force, vitality, energy coursing through beings and objects alike. When the Moai were erected, they were said to channel this mana, drawing strength from ancestors and sky, funneling it into the community. But what if mana was not only a spiritual metaphor, but an early intuition of energy fields that modern science only now begins to describe? Could the Moai have been constructed in places where geomagnetic currents run strongest, where underground lava flows, mineral veins, or seismic tensions create invisible rivers of power? In this view, the statues were not simply carved, they were planted, rooted like colossal tuning forks in the soil of a living earth. The concept of monuments transmitting energy is not unique to Easter Island. Consider the Great Pyramids of Giza, aligned with true north to within fractions of a degree, or Stonehenge, whose megaliths resonate like bells when struck, their arrangement amplifying sound into haunting frequencies. Consider the Nazca lines, spread across desert plains, forming vast patterns only visible from the air, as if to speak not to human eyes, but to something greater. All these constructions suggest an obsession not only with what is seen, but with what is felt, forces of magnetism, resonance, light, and vibration that interlace the world. The Moai, standing on one of the most remote islands on Earth, may have been the Pacific voice in this global chorus. Some theorists speak of ley lines, imaginary or perhaps real pathways of energy that crisscross the globe, connecting sacred sites and geometric alignments too precise to be coincidence. From the Great Pyramid to Machu Picchu, from Stonehenge to Easter Island, patterns emerge that suggest intentional placement. Could the Moai have been positioned as markers on these lines, anchoring the Pacific node of an energy grid spanning the planet? To skeptics, this is fantasy. To those who allow the possibility, it is revelation, that ancient builders knew the Earth was alive with power, and that monuments were the acupuncture needles in its skin, channeling vitality for human use. Imagine standing before a Moai at dusk. The wind falls silent. The ground beneath your feet hums almost imperceptibly. Your heart synchronizes with the rhythm of the waves. Suddenly, the stone face above you no longer seems inert. It becomes a participant in the environment, a transmitter, a receiver, a bridge, perhaps sound, perhaps magnetism, perhaps something we do not yet name. The ancients were not engineers of steel, but engineers of resonance. They carved not merely for beauty, but for harmony with the deep architecture of the Earth itself. Some researchers point to experiments where stone chambers amplify low frequencies, the so-called Earth hum, vibrations resonating between 2 and 7 hertz, frequencies known to affect human consciousness. Could the Moai, tall and narrow, their stone bodies embedded deeply into volcanic soil, have been designed to interact with these frequencies, transmitting them across platforms and communities? If the statues were aligned, they may have formed resonant chains, like tuning forks arranged in sequence, each amplifying the other, sending pulses of energy outward into the Pacific night. But transmission may not have been limited to the island itself. Consider that Polynesian navigators were masters of the sea, sailing thousands of miles guided by stars, waves, and currents. What if the Moai served as terrestrial anchors for a larger network that included celestial alignments? Placed upon energy nodes, aligned with constellations, they may have acted as mirrors of the sky, bridging earth and heavens, transmitting not electricity, but intention, prayer, and rhythm across unimaginable distances. In this sense, energy transmission was not technological. It was spiritual, yet no less real. Global comparisons deepen the intrigue. In Peru, the walls of Sacsayhuaman are fitted with such precision that not even a blade of grass fits between their stones. Some claim they too channel energy, their zigzag shapes amplifying telluric currents. In India, temple spires are said to conduct cosmic forces downward, energizing the sanctum. In Egypt, pyramids may have focused electromagnetic fields, their chambers resonating with the frequencies of the earth. Again and again, we see the same obsession. Monuments as conductors, transmitters, resonators. Why should Easter Island, isolated though it was, be different? Perhaps the Moai were not anomalies, but essential links in this planetary architecture of power. Legends beyond Rapa Nui echo the same. In Maori traditions of New Zealand, stones were believed to hold life force, absorbing and releasing energy like living beings. In Hawaiian chants, stones were described as bones of the earth, vibrating with mana. The Moai, then, may have been less inert idols and more living technologies, stone machines designed to resonate with forces that modern humans have forgotten how to sense. Skeptics demand evidence, measurable data, proof of transmission. And yet, is it not striking that so many ancient cultures converged upon the same impulse? To carve, to align, to erect, to anchor stone in ways that outlast millennia? Even if the energy transmitted was symbolic rather than electrical, its effect on human consciousness was undeniable. Standing before the Moai, villagers felt the ancestors near, felt protection radiate, felt community drawn tighter under their gaze. If this is not transmission, what is? Energy does not always travel through wires. It travels through belief, through awe, through resonance between heartbeats and stone. And yet, one cannot dismiss entirely the possibility of lost knowledge. What if the Rapa Nui, like the Egyptians, like the builders of Göbekli Tepe, possessed understandings of resonance and magnetism that we no longer possess? What if the Moai once hummed, once vibrated, once glowed faintly in firelight as sound waves or geomagnetic currents flowed through them? Perhaps energy transmission was not a myth, but a reality, one that died when the last chance faded, when the last ropes frayed, when the network of monuments fell silent. Today, researchers return with seismographs, magnetometers, acoustic equipment, seeking traces of what might remain. Occasional anomalies are found, odd magnetic readings near certain statues, unexplained echoes within platforms. These are fragments, hints, nothing conclusive. Yet, in the absence of certainty, the mystery grows. Perhaps this is the truest energy transmission of all, not across continents, but across time. From their builders to us, the Moai still radiate fascination, still compel us to gather, to wonder, to imagine. Their energy is the persistence of mystery itself. What then are we to make of the theory of energy transmission between monuments? It may never be proven in laboratories, yet it survives in the felt experience of standing before stone. The Moai endure as nodes of awe, broadcasting silence that becomes thunder in the mind. They are transmitters of presence, of mystery, of endurance, and perhaps that was always the point. Not to light cities, but to light souls, not to power machines, but to power meaning. Consider for a moment how carefully the statues are positioned. Many Moai do not face the sea, as one might expect of sentinels, but face inland, toward the villages. This orientation suggests that their gaze was not outward defense, but inward transmission, sending energy, protection, and ancestral power directly into the heart of the community. Their placement was deliberate, a circuitry of stone bodies facing people, platforms arranged like nodes in a living system. When viewed from above, certain alignments revealed geometric order, as though the island itself had been transformed into a giant instrument. Could it be that the Moai were parts of a symphony in stone, each note resonating across the island, each vibration feeding into a larger harmony? In this sense, energy transmission is not merely a matter of physics, but of human psychology. Rituals performed in the presence of the statues were heightened by their aura. Drumming, chanting, and dance all generate rhythm and vibration. Imagine hundreds of voices rising in unison before the towering Moai. The vibrations enter the stone, the sound rebounds, and the community feels the resonance not only in their ears, but in their bones. The Moai, silent themselves, become partners in this performance, amplifiers of culture, transformers of sound into power. Now expand this vision beyond Easter Island. Across the Pacific, in the Marquesas, in Hawaii, in Tahiti, stone platforms called mare served similar purposes, anchoring ritual and community. These too were aligned with stars, positioned with precision, built to magnify presence. It is as though the entire Pacific Basin was once a web of nodes, each island a transmitter of cultural and spiritual energy, each stone monument a receiver and broadcaster. If Polynesians navigated the ocean by waves and stars, might they not also have conceived of their islands as connected in an invisible network, each Moai, each mare, each altar a pulse point in a planetary grid? Even modern science cannot completely dismiss the possibility. Studies show that stone can store and radiate heat, that crystalline structures can resonate with electromagnetic frequencies. Quartz, basalt, and tuff, materials used in monuments worldwide, are not inert. They respond to pressure, to sound, to energy fields. Could it be that ancient builders selected their stones with this knowledge, choosing not only shape but material for its capacity to interact with the unseen? In this light, the Moai are not simply statues, but instruments carved of resonant stone. Their weight and form deliberate choices in a symphony of invisible forces. And then there are the myths that refuse to fade. Stories of statues walking, of voices carried on the wind, of glowing auras seen at night. Such tales may be dismissed as legend, yet legend often grows from kernels of truth. Perhaps the walking of the Moai referred not only to their transportation, but to the sense that they moved energy across the land. Perhaps the glow was not light, but the aura of awe, the energy of community belief manifesting as experience. Energy transmission may not have been technological in the modern sense, but it was real enough to those who felt it, saw it, lived it. And consider this. Even in our world today, we remain drawn to these sites. Tourists travel thousands of miles to stand before the Moai. Pilgrims to Stonehenge, to the pyramids, to Machu Picchu speak of tingling skin, of atmospheres charged with an unexplainable force. Is it mere suggestion, or do these ancient monuments truly sit upon places where the Earth's energy is stronger? Science may remain silent, but the human body knows. We feel what instruments do not measure. And that feeling, passed down across centuries, may itself be the transmission, the endurance of presence across time. Ultimately, whether energy flowed as magnetism, resonance, or collective belief, the Moai remain transmitters. They transmit wonder. They transmit endurance. They transmit the voice of ancestors across centuries. Perhaps the most haunting thought is that this was always their purpose, not to send power outward into machines, but to send meaning forward into time. And if that is so, then the transmission has succeeded, for here we are, still listening, still receiving, still changed by their signal. In the end, the Moai may be exactly what they appear to be, colossal ancestors carved from volcanic stone. And yet, they may also be what they feel like, receivers and transmitters of something larger, a network spanning not only space but time, reminding us that human beings have always sought connection, to each other, to the earth, to the stars. If so, then the energy of the Moai still flows, not through wires or circuits, but through us. We are their receivers now, their transmitters, their living continuation. The Moai stare across the island as though guarding not just the land, but the memory of something unspeakable. Beneath their silence lies one of the strangest and most haunting myths of Rapa Nui, the tale of the long-eared people, the Hanau Epe, and the visitors from the sky. It is a myth of conflict, of fire, of betrayal, and perhaps of origins stranger than history can comfortably contain. According to oral tradition, the island was once divided between two peoples. There were the Hanau Epe, the long-eared ones, said to be tall, imposing, and powerful, and there were the Hanau Momoko, the short-eared, who were more numerous but subjugated. The long-eared people are described as master builders, the ones who carved and raised the colossal Moai, while the short-ears labored under their command. For generations, this uneasy hierarchy endured, until a rebellion shattered it forever. The story tells that the short-ears rose against the long-ears, driving them into a trench filled with brush and wood, setting it alight, burning nearly all of them alive. Only a handful escaped. The rule of the long-eared ones ended in flames, and the island passed into new hands. But who were these long-ears? Were they merely a mythic other, invented to explain differences within the island's clans? Or were they echoes of a real migration, a distinct group that once arrived on Easter Island and left their mark? Some accounts describe them as foreign, outsiders who came across the sea, taller than the Rapa Nui, bringing with them the knowledge of stone carving and construction. Others see them as symbols, the ruling elite mythologized into a different race, their dominance transformed into legend through the storytelling of those who eventually overthrew them. And yet, the long-ear myth refuses to die. For centuries, explorers, missionaries, and scholars wrote it down, each time reshaping it, but never erasing it. The long-ears became a riddle, invaders, builders, aristocrats, or perhaps something more. In some tellings, they are connected with the sky, beings who descended from above, who possessed strange knowledge, who were not entirely human. In this vision, the Moai themselves become not only ancestral statues, but records of contact, monuments marking the age when the sky touched the earth. Sky visitors. The phrase seems out of place on a remote Pacific island, yet myths of beings from above recur across the world. The Dogon of Africa spoke of star gods from Sirius. The Hopi of North America told of sky kachinas who descended to teach humanity. The Sumerians carved winged beings descending from the heavens. In Polynesia, the sky is alive with gods who walk among mortals, who descend in vessels of light, who lift chosen people upward. Easter Island's stories of sky visitors fit into this larger human pattern, echoing a timeless intuition that we are not alone, that knowledge comes from beyond, that the heavens once reached down to touch us. But perhaps the myth is more grounded. Anthropologists see in the story of the long ears a memory of social collapse, a violent turning point when the oppressed overthrew the powerful. The fire in the trench may be symbolic of cultural transformation, the burning of one way of life and the birth of another. Yet even if purely metaphorical, the myth still clings to the strange detail of the ears. Why ears? Why long ears, elongated with ornaments and weight? Indeed, in many Polynesian societies, ear elongation was a sign of nobility, a bodily marker of status. Perhaps the long ears were not a separate people at all, but simply the ruling elite, whose stretched lobes distinguished them from commoners. And when the rebellion came, it was not against foreigners, but against their own aristocracy. Myth transformed rulers into another race, another people, and their fall into legend. Still, the association with sky visitors lingers. When European explorers arrived on Rapa Nui, some islanders pointed to the statues and claimed they represented those who had come from the stars. These were not simply ancestors, they were watchers, messengers, guardians placed by beings from elsewhere. Was this an invention under colonial questioning, or a fragment of older belief? It is impossible to know. Yet the fact remains that the Moai do not look like ordinary people. Their heads are elongated, their ears long, their features abstract, as if stylized not to reflect the present, but to echo a memory from beyond. The story of the long ears and the short ears also mirrors other global tales of conflict between races or peoples. In South America, myths speak of giants who once walked the land, destroyed in fire. In Mesopotamia, texts speak of the Anunnaki, sky beings who mingled with mortals and were later cast down. In Polynesia itself, many islands contain legends of a first people, taller and stronger, who were eventually displaced by those who came after. It is as if humanity everywhere remembers not one origin, but two. A time of visitors, giants, or strangers, followed by a time of ordinary human rule. Easter Island's long ears may be the Pacific's version of this enduring myth. Imagine standing at the edge of the trench where the long ears were said to perish. The flames rise, the crackle of fire mingling with screams, the sky above lit orange against the black vastness of the Pacific. What if this was not just rebellion, but ritual cleansing, the attempt to erase not only a people, but their memory? And yet, they were not erased. The Moai still stand. The myth still whispers. The long ears burn forever in story, their ash carried on the wind into eternity. There are those who push the theory further. They ask, what if the long ears were not human at all? What if they were remnants of an older civilization, survivors from a sunken land like Mu or Lemuria, who brought their knowledge of stone to Easter Island? What if their connection to the sky was not metaphor, but memory, of ships descending, of beings who came with purpose and left monuments to mark their passing? Such ideas lie beyond archaeology, yet they persist because the stones themselves invite them. The Moai, with their enigmatic expressions and cosmic silence, seem made for mystery, as if deliberately designed to stir questions that have no answers. And here lies the haunting truth. Myths are not bound to fact alone. They are vessels for memory, trauma, awe, and wonder. Whether the long ears were rulers, foreigners, or visitors from the sky, the story survives because it touches something universal, the fear of domination, the hope of liberation, the suspicion that knowledge comes from beyond us, and the warning that every power, no matter how great, will one day fall. Consider how often myths of long-eared, elongated-headed beings appear across cultures. In ancient Peru, the Paracas people practiced cranial elongation, reshaping skulls into tall forms that seem otherworldly to modern eyes. In Africa, certain tribes elongated ears with ornaments as symbols of wisdom and spiritual authority. In Buddhist iconography, the Buddha himself is often depicted with long ears, stretched by the heavy jewelry of his princely youth, signifying the renunciation of earthly wealth for spiritual vision. Why then do long ears appear on Easter Island? Was it simple cultural practice, or was it an echo of something larger, a shared memory that stretched across oceans? The myth of the long ears on Rapa Nui may also conceal a deeper psychological truth. The tension between those who build and those who serve, between elite and commoner, between rulers who command monuments and the masses who bear the weight of creation. When the rebellion came, it was not merely the end of one group. It was a catharsis, a reversal of hierarchy written into fire. The trench of burning wood was not only execution, but purification, the destruction of an oppressive order. Such myths survive not because they are factual, but because they dramatize the eternal struggle of humanity against power. And yet, in the strange way that myths bend time, the long ears are not entirely destroyed. They persist in the statues. The Moai, with their elongated heads and ears, may in fact be representations of them, immortalizing those who were cast down. If so, then the short ears who triumphed could never fully erase their oppressors. They carried them forward in stone, in memory, in ritual. In trying to burn them, they ensured their eternal survival. There is irony here. Rebellion creates remembrance, not oblivion. Then there are the stories of sky visitors. In some Rapa Nui traditions, the ancestors came not only by canoe, but by descending from above. They were described as shining, powerful, different. Were these merely metaphors for chiefs arriving in great sails, their canoes glinting in the sun? Or were they mythic reimaginings of encounters with something humanity once knew, but forgot? Every culture tells stories of beings from the sky. Gods, messengers, or teachers. The long ears' association with the heavens may place them within this timeless archetype, figures who descend, dominate, and then vanish, leaving monuments as their trace. The global parallels are staggering. The Dogon of Mali spoke of the Nomo, beings from Sirius who taught them astronomy. The Maya carved stelae of gods descending from above, bringing tools and calendars. The Maori of Aotearoa remembered their ancestors guided by shining beings across the sea. The Greeks told of titans and Olympians, sky dwellers and earth dwellers locked in conflict. The Norse sang of giants and gods clashing in cycles of fire and rebirth. Easter Island's tale of long ears and short ears sits comfortably within this global tapestry, its details unique but its essence shared. The story of two peoples, one dominant, one rising, their struggle bound up with the stars. Imagine the psychology of the Rapa Nui child hearing this story. He grows up in the shadow of Moai, their ears carved long, their faces stern. He is told that these are the likenesses of the long ears, once rulers, now gone. He learns that his people overthrew them, that freedom came through fire. But as he looks at the statues, he cannot help but feel their gaze still heavy, their presence undiminished. The story empowers him, yet also binds him to the vanished oppressors. The myth becomes not only history, but destiny, shaping how generations view power, rebellion, and memory. Some fringe theories push the narrative toward lost continents. They claim the long ears were survivors of Lemuria, a sunken Pacific landmass who carried advanced knowledge across the ocean. They point to similarities between the Moai and statues in South America, to shared myths of giants, to cranial elongation practices scattered across the globe. Perhaps, they argue, the long ears were remnants of a global seafaring civilization, their memory now reduced to myth. Such ideas cannot be proven, yet they persist because the stones themselves invite them. The Moai's faces do not answer, but they compel us to ask. Even the detail of burning in a trench carries echoes across mythologies. In South America, giants were destroyed in fire sent by the gods. In biblical stories, Sodom and Gomorrah fell in flames from heaven. In Polynesian myth, Maui sought fire from the underworld. To destroy with fire is to mark a transition, to end one age and begin another. Thus, the long ear's fiery end becomes not only history, but cosmology. The old order reduced to ash, the new rising from the embers. The myth of sky visitors extends even further. On Easter Island, the god Make is associated with creation, fertility, and the heavens. His cult included birdman rituals tied to the arrival of migratory birds from the sky. In these rituals, men risked their lives to capture the first egg of the sooty tern, a symbolic gift from the heavens. The long ears, associated with sky and power, may have been linked to this cosmology, their downfall part of a shift from one divine order to another. Perhaps the rebellion was not only political, but religious, a rejection of sky beings for earth ancestors, a turning inward after centuries of outward gaze. And still the statues stand, elongated ears carved into stone, silent reminders of a vanished race, or an elite, or a myth. Whether they were rulers or strangers, oppressors or gods, they endure not in flesh, but in memory, in the weight of stone that refuses to be forgotten. Each Moai is a paradox, at once a monument to power and a monument to its overthrow, at once a guardian of the living and a whisper of the sky. Perhaps this is why the story endures. It is not about who the long ears really were, but about what they represent. The fragility of dominance, the inevitability of change, the haunting suspicion that our greatest monuments are not only ours, but gifts or warnings from beyond. The Moai, with their long ears and hollow eyes, seem to wait for us to decide which truth we will accept. Were they carved by men, by strangers, by sky visitors? Or do they simply remind us that history is layered, that myth is truth in another form, and that some questions were never meant to be answered? In the silence of Easter Island, the wind moves through the grass, waves crash against black volcanic cliffs, and the Moai keep their eternal watch. Their long ears listen still, perhaps not to us, but to the echoes of those who came before, and perhaps to those who came from the sky. On Easter Island, the statues look outward, but their true gaze may not have been fixed upon the earth at all. They may have been turned toward the sky. The Rapa Nui, like other Polynesian peoples, were master navigators, reading the stars as maps across the ocean. To them, the heavens were not distant abstractions. They were living guides, calendars, and compasses. The Moai, rooted in volcanic soil, may have been earthly extensions of this celestial knowledge, monumental observatories that joined heaven and earth. Archaeologists have long noted that many ahu, the platforms on which the Moai stand, are aligned with astronomical events. Some face the solstices, catching the rising or setting sun at the longest and shortest days of the year. Others align with the equinoxes, moments when light and darkness share the day equally. These alignments were not accidental. They were deliberate choices, embedding the cycles of the sky into stone, so that every dawn and every dusk became a performance of cosmic order. The Moai, gazing outward, became witnesses to the marriage of sky and earth, their silent faces tracking rhythms older than memory. This fascination with the heavens was not unique to Easter Island. At Stonehenge in England, the great trilithons frame the midsummer sunrise. At Giza, the pyramids align with Orion's belt, and their shafts point toward the North Star and other celestial markers. In Peru, Machu Picchu is built along solstitial lines, its stones casting shadows that turn staircases into calendars. In Mexico, at Chichen Itza, the serpent of light descends the pyramid of Kukulkan on the equinox, as if the gods themselves walk with the sun. Everywhere, across continents and oceans, humans looked up in carved stone to meet the sky. Easter Island belongs to this great tradition. Some scholars argue that the orientation of certain Moai reflects knowledge of the star Canopus, one of the brightest in the southern sky, used in Polynesian navigation. Others suggested alignments with Aldebaran, Sirius, or the Pleiades, all critical markers for voyagers crossing vast seas. When the Pleiades disappeared from the sky in May, it signaled the arrival of winter. When they returned, the season shifted again. To fix a Moai in alignment with such stars was to inscribe time itself into stone, to anchor the cycle of the heavens in the permanence of the earth. Imagine standing on the island at dawn, watching the sun rise directly behind a Moai aligned with the solstice. The shadow stretches across the platform, reaching like a dark hand into the village. The people gather, chanting, drumming, watching as the sky confirms the calendar, as ancestors carved in stone receive the fire of the sun. This was not mere observation. It was communion. The sky spoke, and the Moai bore witness, transmitting the message of the heavens to those below. The question grows larger. Why did so many cultures, scattered across time and geography, build monuments aligned with the same celestial events? Why did they choose the solstices, the equinoxes, the rising of Orion or Sirius or the Pleiades? It is tempting to see coincidence, but the pattern is too consistent. Perhaps the sky itself demanded attention. The sun, the moon, the stars, they rule seasons, tides, harvests, survival. To ignore them was to risk death. To master them was to master time. But beyond survival, there was meaning. By aligning stone with sky, humans declared themselves participants in the cosmos, their lives woven into the same rhythms as stars. The Moai thus become more than statues. They are instruments of time, calendars of light, bridges between mortality and eternity. When the sun sets behind a platform exactly on the equinox, it is as though the heavens are confirming human order, as though the universe nods in recognition of ritual. The Rapa Nui were not alone in this hunger. The builders of Stonehenge, the Egyptians, the Mayans, the Incas, all carved the same question into stone. Where do we stand in the cosmos, and how can we inscribe our place upon it? Some theorists push further, suggesting that these alignments were not only for human eyes, but for communication with the beyond. If one places monuments across the globe in alignment with each other and with the stars, does one not create a kind of network, a geometry that spans the planet, visible from above? Could Easter Island, with its Moai facing the stars, have been a signal to watchers beyond Earth, a message inscribed in stone that humanity was aware, attentive, ready? Such speculation finds echoes in myths. The Rapa Nui spoke of sky visitors, beings who came from above to teach or to rule. If the Moai were aligned with the stars, were they messages to these beings, affirmations that the islanders remembered, that they awaited return? Across the world, myths tell of gods descending from the sky and promising to return. Perhaps monuments like the Moai were not only calendars, but invitations, beacons lit in stone, forever calling back the visitors who once walked among mortals. Modern science does not confirm such cosmic networks, but it cannot erase the awe of standing among these stones. On Easter Island, as on Salisbury Plain, as on the Giza Plateau, one feels the same sensation. The sky and earth locked together in architecture, human hands making stone obey the stars. Whether for farming, ritual, or something more mysterious, the result is the same. Humans reaching beyond themselves, anchoring the infinite in rock. Consider the skill required. To align a platform with the solstice, one must observe the sun's movement across years, marking where it rises and falls, noticing its slow drift and return. This demands patience, attention, continuity of knowledge across generations. It demands a culture devoted to watching, to listening to the sky. The Moai are thus not only monuments, but evidence of centuries of observation, of a people who saw the cosmos not as distant, but as intimately connected to their survival and meaning. The alignments also tied the island to its navigational tradition. For the Polynesians, stars were highways. Each star had a rising and setting point, a place on the horizon that guided canoes across the sea. By aligning Moai with these stars, the Rapa Nui may have inscribed their seafaring heritage into the land itself, creating a map in stone, a memory of journeys that spanned thousands of miles. The Moai thus stood not only as ancestors, but as navigators, guardians of the routes by which their people had come to this remote island. Yet, one cannot ignore the deeper symbolism. To align with the stars is to confess longing. It is to say, we belong not only here, but there. Our roots are in the earth, but our destiny is in the sky. Every culture that built such monuments seemed to whisper the same desire, to reach upward, to commune with the heavens, to ensure that in the vastness of the cosmos, we are not lost, not forgotten. The Moai, silent and enduring, carry that whisper still. Even today, standing among them, one feels the pull of the stars. The night sky above Easter Island is one of the clearest on Earth, its constellations sharp against the blackness, the Milky Way arcing overhead like a river of light. To see the Moai silhouetted against this sky is to feel that they are still watching, still aligned, still part of a cosmic order that has not ended. The stars move, the earth turns, but the statues remain, anchors of memory in a universe of motion. There is also the haunting possibility that these alignments were used to unify distant cultures. Imagine if each monument across the globe, Easter Island, Giza, Stonehenge, Teotihuacan, was not only oriented to the heavens, but also subtly aligned with each other. From a bird's eye view, or perhaps from a vantage point in orbit, a pattern might emerge, a geometry sprawling across continents. Could the builders have been encoding messages not to themselves, but to anyone who watched from above? Were they creating an earth-wide mirror of the constellations, a reminder that humanity was aware of its place in a larger cosmos? Ancient myths echo this idea. The Egyptians called the stars the imperishable ones, eternal beings who guided kings in death. The Mayans believed the Pleiades marked cycles of creation and destruction. The Polynesians saw the stars as ancestors and gods who taught navigation. Everywhere the sky was not separate from humanity, but alive with presence, authority, guidance. To align a monument with a star was not only science, it was devotion. It was covenant. It was saying, we belong to you, and you belong to us. The Rapa Nui's astronomical skill may have been amplified by their isolation. On a remote island with no mountains to obscure the horizon, the sky would have been vast and unbroken, every star rising and setting like a clock hand on a cosmic dial. Generations of watching this dial would allow precision that we today cannot fathom without instruments. In this sense, the Moai are frozen acts of observation, memories of countless nights of stargazing carved into volcanic stone. And when we widen the scope to other ancient sites, the similarities are almost eerie. As Nazca lines of Peru stretch across deserts in shapes visible only from above, aligned with solstices and certain stars, Angkor Wat in Cambodia aligns with the spring equinox, its towers marking celestial cycles as faithfully as any clock. The Great Zimbabwe ruins may also contain solstitial lines. From Europe to Asia, Africa to Oceania, humanity left the same fingerprint, stone pointed toward the heavens. Modern astronomy has discovered that many of these alignments were extraordinarily precise. At Chichen Itza, the play of light and shadow on the equinox occurs within minutes. At Stonehenge, the midsummer sunrise splits the heel stone exactly. If Easter Island's Moai are part of this same tradition, it means the island was not only connected by ocean voyages, but by participation in a global human project to turn the Earth itself into a mirror of the stars. And so, we must ask, what did they hope to achieve? Were they ensuring that their calendars remained accurate, that their crops were planted and harvested at the right times? Certainly. But beyond that, they were making a statement, that they were not small, not forgotten, not adrift in an endless cosmos. By aligning their monuments, they inscribed permanence into an impermanent world. Stone stands while generations fade, and stars too endure, wheeling overhead in eternal cycles. The Moai thus linked human fragility with cosmic endurance, making the fleeting lives of their builders part of the universe's eternal dance. Even in the present, the effect is undeniable. Astronomers who visit Easter Island often remark on the clarity of its skies. To stand among the Moai beneath the Milky Way is to feel the illusion of time collapse, to know that the same stars witnessed by the Rapa Nui still burn above, unchanged. The statues stand as if in dialogue with them, as if waiting for us to remember the conversation humanity once had with the cosmos. Ultimately, astronomical alignments remind us that these monuments are not relics of superstition, but works of science, art, and longing. They prove that ancient peoples were observers of extraordinary patience, scientists who required no laboratories beyond the sky itself, artists who carved calendars in stone, philosophers who asked not only how to survive, but how to belong in the infinite. And the Moai, like their counterparts across the globe, continue to ask us the same question. Do we still look to the stars, or have we forgotten the dialogue written in stone? The soil of Easter Island does not only hold stone, it holds memory, coded not in carvings, but in blood. For centuries, the Rapa Nui people lived in isolation, surrounded by the boundless Pacific, their nearest neighbors hundreds, even thousands of miles away. And yet, when modern science turned its gaze toward their DNA, strange patterns began to emerge. Patterns that seemed to whisper of contact far beyond the limits of what tradition had suggested. The great mystery begins with Polynesian voyaging itself. The ancestors of the Rapa Nui were seafarers, navigating by stars, waves, and birds, crossing distances that to us seem almost impossible without instruments. Their genetic legacy is rooted in the islands of Southeast Asia and Oceania, a slow spread eastward across centuries, leaving markers in their DNA as clear as footprints on sand. But within the blood of the Rapa Nui, there are hints of something more, threads that do not neatly belong to Polynesia alone. In certain studies, fragments resembling native South American ancestry have appeared. It is as though the islanders' genes remember encounters that history has forgotten. How could this be? Some scientists argue that long before Europeans reached Easter Island, the Rapa Nui had already touched other shores, or others had touched theirs. There are theories of Polynesian canoes reaching the coast of South America, bringing back not only new crops like the sweet potato, but also human contact, exchanges of breath, blood, and lineage. The sweet potato itself is one of the strongest clues, native to South America, yet found thriving in Polynesia centuries before European contact. Its very name in Polynesian languages, Kumara, remarkably similar to the Quechua word, kumar, is like a linguistic fossil, a memory of connection preserved in sound. If crops could travel across oceans, why not people? Why not genes? DNA studies have shown tantalizing results. Some findings suggest that Rapa Nui individuals carried Native American ancestry dating as far back as the 13th century, long before the arrival of Europeans. Others remain more cautious, pointing out that contamination, sampling, or later contact could also explain the traces. But the very possibility that Polynesians and South Americans met across thousands of miles of open sea reframes everything we think we know about pre-Columbian contact. It suggests a world less divided, a world where ancient mariners stitched continents together with invisible threads of kinship. And then there are whispers of stranger possibilities still. In the deepest analyses of genetic material, scientists sometimes find anomalies that resist easy explanation, mutations that appear in unusual frequencies or sequences that do not perfectly match any nearby populations. Most can be explained by drift, isolation, or the strange mathematics of small gene pools, but some cannot help but stir wonder. Are these the legacies of forgotten voyages, or are they signs of something more enigmatic, a genetic fingerprint of visitors whose stories were never recorded? Legends on the island speak of two peoples, the long ears and the short ears, groups that may once have warred, intermarried, and merged into the society known today. Could the unusual genetic traces be remnants of such divisions? Or could they point to migrations that left no monuments but lived on in flesh? There are even more daring theories that the so-called long ears were not merely another Polynesian group, but outsiders entirely, bearing genes from distant shores, even distant continents. If so, the Moai may not only commemorate ancestors, but embody a history of encounters and minglings more complex than archaeology alone can tell. The idea of Easter Island as part of a global network is sharpened by these genetic mysteries. If the blood of its people carries hints of faraway lands, then the Moai are not simply stone statues watching over a small island, but markers of a crossroads where humanity's great journeys converged. They may stand as silent guardians of genetic stories, holding in their gaze the memory of encounters the world has not yet fully deciphered. Even today, genetic research continues to refine its story. Advanced techniques, sequencing entire genomes rather than fragments, are beginning to uncover more about the migrations that shaped Polynesia. Each discovery adds both clarity and complication. Yes, the Polynesians reached the most remote corners of the Pacific. Yes, they may have touched South America before Columbus ever crossed the Atlantic. But with each answer comes new questions. How often did such contacts happen? Were they rare accidents or regular exchanges? Did entire families cross, settle, and merge? Or were they fleeting encounters, brief moments of exchange leaving only faint echoes in DNA? There is also the haunting possibility of knowledge lost. What if the Rapa Nui once remembered these connections clearly, but centuries of collapse, deforestation, and colonial disruption erased the memory, leaving only traces in genes and myths? The Moai themselves, half buried in earth, forgotten by outside eyes for centuries, are like their people's DNA, fragments of a story waiting to be unearthed. One cannot help but wonder at the broader implications. If Polynesians and South Americans met, it challenges the neat boundaries drawn around civilizations. It suggests that ancient humans were not as isolated as we often imagine. They were explorers, bridge builders, travelers whose canoes and sails were as transformative as any invention of the modern world. In their DNA, they carried not only survival, but memory, and in their mingling, they forged links across the world long before globalization became a word. And then, in the more speculative realm, there are those who whisper that unusual genetic traces might suggest contact not only with distant lands, but with something else entirely. What if the visitors the Rapa Nui legends describe as sky beings left more than myth? What if their mark lies, however faintly, in the helix of life itself? Most scientists would dismiss this as fantasy, but the allure remains. In every unexplainable mutation, every genetic oddity, we glimpse the possibility of forgotten stories, stories too strange to fit comfortably in textbooks. Perhaps the truth is more ordinary, and yet equally wondrous. Perhaps the unusual genetic traces on Easter Island are reminders of humanity's restless spirit, its refusal to remain confined, its hunger to cross seas and boundaries. Perhaps they are proof that even on the most remote island in the world, humanity was never entirely alone, but always part of a larger tapestry of movement, encounter, and exchange. And so, when we look at the Moai, we are not only looking at stone, we are looking at the faces of ancestors whose blood carried journeys across unimaginable distances. We are looking at the silent witnesses of encounters lost to history, but preserved in flesh. And as science continues to read these stories written in DNA, we are reminded that the past is not finished. It lingers in us, waiting to be heard, waiting to be seen, waiting for the day when its mysteries, like the statues themselves, rise again from the earth to meet the light. To understand the meaning of DNA on Easter Island, we must also consider the fragility of genetic memory. Unlike stone, which endures wind and rain, DNA is delicate, easily broken, easily erased by time. Every sequence we recover is a miracle of survival. Every test is a dialogue with ghosts. When researchers handle bones, teeth, or strands of hair, they are not merely working with matter. They are holding the whispers of lives once lived, the breath of people who stood before the Moai and prayed. The debates among scientists are intense. Some argue that the traces of Native American ancestry are clear, dating to centuries before Europeans. Others insist that the signals may have come later, through indirect contact, after colonization began to connect distant worlds. The arguments swirl in journals, conferences, and laboratories, and beneath them all is a deeper truth. Whatever the exact date of contact, the Rapa Nui were never as isolated as we once imagined. Isolation is a story we tell about them. Connection is the story their DNA tells about themselves. But let us not forget that genetic evidence is not merely science, it is personal, intimate. For the descendants of the Rapa Nui, DNA testing is not abstract data, but a mirror held up to ancestry. It can affirm identity or complicate it, raise pride or raise painful questions. What does it mean if one's blood carries traces of forgotten outsiders? Does it dilute tradition, or does it enrich it? Perhaps the lesson of DNA is that identity is never singular. It is always a confluence, a weaving together of many journeys. The Moai themselves are not the work of a single hand. They are collective, communal, layered across generations. So too is human blood. This genetic mystery resonates with similar puzzles across the world. In North America, traces of Polynesian DNA have been claimed in coastal tribes. In Madagascar, the people carry both African and Southeast Asian ancestry, a living record of journeys across the Indian Ocean. The Vikings left their genes in Greenland. The Bantu expansion reshaped Africa's bloodlines. Everywhere we look, we see that humans are never still, never confined, but always mixing, merging, voyaging. The Rapa Nui are not an exception. They are part of this universal pattern. And yet, the case of Easter Island is unique in its intensity. Here, on one of the most isolated specks of land on Earth, the presence of outside genes feels almost supernatural. It is as though the island is trying to tell us that there are no true edges in the human story, only intersections waiting to be rediscovered. Some myths even suggest that the first settlers were not alone. There are tales of strangers arriving, sometimes welcomed, sometimes feared. The memory of long ears versus short ears may echo not only social divisions, but genetic ones. Was this conflict, preserved in myth, also preserved in blood? Did the victors of that struggle absorb the defeated, their genes living on, even as their names vanished? If so, the unusual traces in Rapa Nui DNA are not random. They are witnesses to violence, to survival, to the mingling of peoples whose stories were never written down. The Moai may also hold clues. If they represent ancestors, then the very diversity in their faces, the variety of expressions, noses, brows, could reflect a recognition of mixture, a sculpted memory that their people were never homogeneous, but always shaped by encounter. We often think of genetic science as separate from art, but perhaps the stone faces of the Moai are an artistic rendering of what DNA now confirms, that ancestry is not singular but plural, not fixed but fluid. As technology improves, scientists are beginning to reconstruct more than ancestry. They can now predict eye color, hair texture, even disease susceptibility from ancient remains. Imagine what we might learn if a complete genomic map of the Rapa Nui were made, not only of their ancestry, but of how their unique environment shaped them. Perhaps in their genes are adaptations to scarcity, to ocean living, to isolation and endurance. Perhaps we will discover that their very blood carries lessons for how humans can survive in the most remote places, lessons we may need as we reach for other planets. There is also an ethical dimension. Whose DNA is tested? Who consents to the stories being told? For too long, scientists treated indigenous remains as objects, but today there is a movement to include local voices, to let the Rapa Nui themselves guide the telling of their genetic history. This shift is crucial, because DNA is not just data, it is identity. It belongs first to the people who carry it. And their interpretation may differ from the scientists, not less true, but differently true. For them, unusual genetic traces may not be anomalies to explain away, but reminders of sacred connections, proof that their ancestors walked far and wide. So we arrive at the deepest mystery. If genes carry memory, what do these unusual traces mean for the story of humanity as a whole? They remind us that the neat categories we draw, Polynesian, South American, European, are temporary, artificial. In truth, we are a single species forever in motion, forever entangling ourselves with one another. The Rapa Nui are not separate from this story. They are its embodiment. They stand at the very edge of the world and yet carry within them echoes of distant lands. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of their DNA. That no place, however remote, is truly isolated. That no people, however small in number, is truly alone. That even on a speck of volcanic rock in the Pacific, the human story is vast, tangled, and connected. The Moai gaze outward not only to guard, but to remind us, we have always been connected, and our blood is the map that proves it. The decline of Rapa Nui civilization has long been told as a cautionary tale, a story of human folly written in stone and silence. The massive statues, the Moai, gaze with blank eyes across a barren landscape, their silent faces used for decades as evidence that the people who raised them had destroyed themselves. The popular narrative was simple. The Rapa Nui cut down their forests to move their statues, exhausting the land, collapsing their society, and leaving only ruins behind. In this version of the story, the island becomes a miniature planet, a parable of overconsumption, where human ambition devoured the very foundation of survival. It is a haunting image. The last tree falling, while the people stood surrounded by stone giants, unable to escape the prison they had made. For years, the ecocide hypothesis dominated. Scholars pointed to the island's deforestation, to pollen records showing the disappearance of palm trees, and to skeletal remains suggesting hardship. The image was stark. Once lush, the island had been stripped of trees by its own people, who were consumed by statue building to the point of madness. When the last tree fell, there was no wood for canoes, no means of escape, and the people turned upon themselves in violence and hunger. Civil wars erupted. Food grew scarce, and the statues were toppled as clans fought each other to extinction. Yet, as the decades passed, cracks appeared in the story. Archaeologists began to find evidence that suggested the Rapa Nui had not been reckless destroyers of their land, but careful stewards. They practiced rock mulching, covering soil with stones to retain moisture and enrich nutrients. They carved gardens into the volcanic earth, shaping microclimates that allowed crops to thrive in difficult conditions. Rather than collapsing suddenly, the society appears to have adapted ingeniously, surviving on their island through techniques that remain effective even today. This is not the mark of a culture blindly consuming itself, but of one deeply attuned to its environment. So why does the myth of collapse persist? Perhaps because it resonates with our own anxieties. Easter Island feels like the world in miniature, an isolated sphere with limited resources, ringed by water. To imagine its people destroying themselves is to see our own reflection, to imagine our own future if we too exhaust the planet. The statues become silent judges, staring across centuries to remind us of what may await if we do not learn restraint. But this projection may obscure the real story, which is one of survival, adaptation, and endurance. When European contact came in the early 18th century, everything changed. Diseases swept the island, diseases the Rapa Nui had never encountered and had no immunity against. Populations plummeted, families were torn apart. Then came the slave raids. ships from Peru that captured islanders by the hundreds, dragging them across the ocean to toil and die far from home. Those who returned brought more disease. By the 19th century, the once thriving population of thousands had dwindled to just a few hundred survivors. This collapse was not of their own making. It was imposed upon them by forces they could not control. And yet even this is too simple a story. The islanders did not vanish. Their descendants live still, carrying culture, memory, and resilience. The myths of cannibalism and savagery that European chroniclers wrote may have been distortions, exaggerations, or outright lies designed to justify colonial control. Oral traditions speak of conflict between groups, yes, but not of senseless annihilation. Archaeological evidence for large-scale warfare is thin. The massive tales of massacre may have been the invention of outsiders, superimposed on a people already suffering from invasion and disease. The image of collapse on Rapa Nui was powerful because it seemed so clear, so absolute. Western historians and environmentalists seized on it, repeating the phrase, "the island that ate itself." But the more carefully we listen to the earth, the less simple the story becomes. The pollen trapped in lakes tells us that palm forests disappeared long before the island reached its supposed peak population. The rats brought by the first Polynesian canoes may have devoured seeds and prevented regrowth, accelerating deforestation in ways beyond human control. The trees did not fall only by axe or fire, they were gnawed down by tiny teeth, a slow ecological sabotage written in silence. And yet, the Rapa Nui did not collapse in despair when the trees vanished. They innovated. They constructed stone-lined gardens called manavai to shelter plants from wind and to trap moisture. They built rock gardens across the island, scattering stones over the soil, which retained heat, slowed evaporation, and nourished the crops. This was not the behavior of people destroying their world blindly, but of people listening to their land and adapting in creative resilience. It is difficult to reconcile this ingenuity with the image of senseless collapse, the myths of warfare, of spears called mata scattered across the island, of battles between clans who toppled each other's statues, are also contested. The mataha, once believed to be weapons, may have been farming tools. The fallen statues may not mark violence at all, but simply the slow erosion of neglect, or deliberate ritual acts as spiritual systems shifted. To frame the decline as massacre is to impose a narrative of violence, when the evidence may speak instead of continuity and adaptation. But then came outsiders, and the island entered a new chapter of tragedy. When Jacob Roggeveen arrived in 1722, he described a population still vibrant, still building, still praying to the Moai. Only after waves of European contact did the population begin to collapse. Smallpox, tuberculosis, syphilis, diseases that traveled faster than ships, raged across the island. The Peruvian slave raids of the 1860s carried away thousands, an unimaginable blow for such a small community. And missionaries, armed with zeal and colonial authority, banned traditional practices, suppressing chants, carvings, and dances. The so-called collapse was not an internal failure, but an invasion from beyond the horizon. The narrative of massacre, then, may be less about islanders killing one another and more about the slow, grinding massacre of colonialism. The voices of the Rapa Nui were drowned out by foreign pens, their suffering recast as proof of their supposed savagery. What survives in European records is a distorted reflection, designed to justify domination. Yet oral traditions, when listened to, speak of continuity. Songs and stories passed down, ancestors still honored, resilience enduring even in chains. There is also the psychological layer. Why does the West cling so tightly to the idea of collapse? Because Easter Island functions as a mirror for our own fears. It is an island, finite and fragile, just as Earth is in the cosmos. To imagine the Rapa Nui destroying themselves is to imagine our own future. The barren landscape becomes an allegory for climate change, for resource exhaustion, for a humanity that cannot restrain itself. It is convenient to use the Moai as symbols, but in doing so, we risk silencing the real people who carved them. We risk learning the wrong lesson, believing the islanders to be a warning, when in truth they were a testament to survival. Perhaps what collapsed was not their society, but our ability to see them clearly. Perhaps the massacre was of memory itself, a distortion repeated until it became more real than truth. Today, Descendants of the Rapa Nui resist these stories, insisting that their ancestors were not self-destructive but resourceful. To honor them is not to repeat the myth of collapse, but to tell the story of endurance. And yet, there is still mystery. Archaeologists continue to debate, to test soil, to analyze bones. Some evidence does suggest periods of conflict, of scarcity, of hunger. Perhaps there were moments when neighbors turned against neighbors, when food was scarce, and desperation gave rise to violence. But is that not true of all societies at the edge of survival? To reduce their story to collapse is to erase the nuance, the long centuries of thriving that came before. When we speak of decline, then, we must do so with humility. The statues remain, colossal and enduring, not as tombstones of a fallen people, but as monuments of persistence. Each Moai is not a warning of death, but a declaration of survival. The island did not fall into silence. It was silenced by others. And yet, in the chants and dances revived today, in the pride of the Rapa Nui reclaiming their heritage, the silence cracks, and the true story begins again. The lesson may not be one of collapse at all, but of the danger of believing in collapse too easily. For when we tell the story of Easter Island as myth or massacre, we reveal less about them and more about ourselves. We show our fear of the future, our readiness to imagine endings, our hunger for cautionary tales. But if we listen to the land, the bones, the people, we hear something different. Not destruction, but resilience. Not madness, but ingenuity. Not despair, but endurance. So let the Moai stand not as symbols of death, but as guardians of survival. Let them remind us that civilizations are not fragile flowers that wither at the first drought, but living tapestries that adapt, shift, and transform. And let them remind us, too, that sometimes the greatest massacre is not of people, but of truth. Across continents and across millennia, the human impulse to carve faces into stone has echoed like a refrain, rising again and again in places that, on the surface, should have had no connection. On Easter Island, the Moai stand with their elongated heads and heavy brows, guardians of a windswept world. Yet, if you travel across the Pacific, to the jungles of Mesoamerica, you encounter the colossal Olmec heads. Massive stone faces, lips pursed, eyes wide, staring into eternity. Thousands of miles apart, separated by oceans and centuries, both peoples carved humanity into stone at a scale that defied reason. Why? What compels a society to raise the face into monument, to fix expression into the hardest of substances? Was it coincidence? Or was it connection? In South America, the Andean civilizations left their own stone visages, carved into walls and temple facades. At Tiwanaku, in the highlands near Lake Titicaca, rows of stone heads stare outward from the walls of the Kalasasaya, each distinct, each carrying a personality frozen in rock. Some scholars argue these heads represent conquered peoples, captured forever in the eternal stone memory of empire. Others see them as ancestors, spirits who still watch over the living. Either way, the repetition of the face is unmistakable, presence eternalized through stone. If you move north, across the Mediterranean, the island of Malta holds its own stone mysteries. The megalithic temples of Hagar Chim and Menajdra feature massive stone blocks arranged in sacred geometry, with carvings of faces and spirals that suggest a worldview where human presence and cosmic order were entwined. Further still, in Turkey, at the site of Göbekli Tepe, 12,000 years old, the oldest known temple complex, we find towering T-shaped pillars carved with animal reliefs and abstract human forms. Among these, hints of faces emerge, hauntingly simple, as if humanity's first attempt to project itself into eternity. How do we explain this strange universality? One answer is coincidence. The human face is the most familiar image we know. To carve it into stone is to preserve identity, to make memory endure. Independent invention, born of shared human psychology, could explain why distant peoples chose similar forms. But another possibility lingers, one that draws those who look for patterns. Perhaps there was connection. Perhaps knowledge traveled farther and earlier than we admit. Perhaps oceans were not barriers, but bridges, and cultures that we think of as isolated were in fact whispering to one another through stone. Consider the Polynesians, master navigators who crossed the Pacific in canoes, guided by stars, swells, and the flight of birds. They reached Easter Island, one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth. If they could do this, Is it so impossible to imagine that other seafarers crossed oceans long before Columbus? Some argue that the similarity between the Moai and the Olmec heads hints at ancient transoceanic contact. Though mainstream archaeology resists this claim, the allure of a forgotten global network of stone remains. There is also the symbolic thread. To carve a face into stone is to insist that presence endures beyond flesh. Stone resists time. A carved face is a defiance of mortality, a statement. I was here, we were here, we will always be here. It is an attempt to make the human gaze eternal, to fix memory into a medium the earth itself cannot easily erase. This may be why we find the same impulse in cultures unconnected by trade or travel. Across the world, humans confront the same riddle. How do we endure? And across the world, they answered in stone. But the similarities are not just symbolic. They extend into form. The heavy brows, the forward gaze, the monumental scale, these recur. At times, the stone faces are so large they dwarf the human body, transforming the individual into the monumental. This raises questions. Were these statues depictions of gods, ancestors, kings, or something else entirely? Were they messages left for future generations, or for visitors not of this earth? Ancient astronaut theories, though speculative, have suggested that the faces may have been designed not for us, but for watchers in the sky. It is an idea as controversial as it is captivating. When you line up the Moai of Easter Island with the Olmec heads of Mexico, with the stone visages of Tiwanaku, with the carvings of Malta and Gobekli Tepe, the repetition begins to whisper of something more than chance. If the Moai were part of a global network, then these other faces may have been nodes in that same system, points on a map we no longer understand. Imagine an ancient knowledge scattered across the earth like fragments of a broken mirror. Each face a shard, reflecting a piece of a whole long lost. The universality of the human face in stone reveals something profound about the psyche of early civilizations. It is not just that they carved images, it is that they chose the face again and again as the vessel of permanence. Think of it. The human face is how we know one another, how we read emotion, how we recognize kin. To capture it in stone is to freeze identity, to place eternity into features that otherwise fade with age and death. In this way, the megalithic faces are not merely art. They are acts of defiance against impermanence. The Moai with their stoic expressions, the Olmec heads with their resolute gazes, the Andean visages watching from temple walls. Each is a statement. Humanity will not vanish into silence. When archaeologists debate the purpose of these faces, they often reduce them to politics. Rulers immortalized, ancestors deified, enemies captured in rock. But this utilitarian view misses something deeper. Faces are not abstract symbols, they are intimate. To carve a face is to carve presence, to raise it upon the land is to place presence into the very horizon. The fact that cultures separated by oceans felt the same compulsion suggests a resonance that transcends borders. It is almost as if humanity, wherever it went, carried within it a subconscious need to make stone remember us. Consider the Olmec heads again, some weighing over 40 tons. Each is individualized, with helmets and expressions that suggest living models. Transporting them required immense labor, cooperation, and devotion. The Moai of Rapa Nui echo this. Their immense weight, their sheer size, demanded collective effort, turning construction into ritual, labor into sacred act. The Andean heads, set into temple walls, multiplied the face into a chorus, as if one gaze was not enough. An entire community of stone visages was needed to bear witness. This multiplication of presence suggests that the face was more than memory. It was surveillance, guardianship, the eternal witness who could never close their eyes. Why stone? Because stone is the closest thing to eternity humans could touch. Unlike wood or cloth, it does not rot. Unlike flesh, it does not wither. By carving faces into it, humanity grafted itself into the eternal substance of the earth. These monuments are less about depicting individuals than about ensuring that humanity itself could not be forgotten. They are masks against oblivion. And perhaps that is why they look alike. Not because of contact or conspiracy, but because all humans confront the same enemy: time. In the face of time, we chose to make faces eternal. Yet the possibility of a global network lingers. When one considers the navigation skills of the Polynesians, or the maritime knowledge of Mediterranean traders, the idea of cultural diffusion does not seem impossible. What if the impulse was not purely independent, but carried, transmitted, whispered along forgotten routes of migration and exploration? What if each megalithic face is not just an echo, but a deliberate continuation of a shared vision, fragments of a larger tradition now scattered and broken? There is also the cosmic angle, faces turned toward the sky, monuments aligned to stars. Perhaps they were part of a dialogue not only across Earth, but with the heavens. The Moai are said to watch over the island, but some also align with celestial events. The Olmec and Maya tracked Venus and the solar cycles. The Andean civilizations aligned temples to solstices. Across the world, stone faces may have been gazes trained not just on us, but on eternity itself. To carve a face into stone is to give the cosmos a witness, to say, "We were here, and we saw you." But what if it is the other way around? What if the faces were meant for the cosmos to see us? From above, from beyond, what would a world look like dotted with colossal faces gazing skyward, waiting? If you imagine Easter Island not in isolation, but as one of many points, Olmec, Andean, Maltese, Turkish, you begin to see a constellation across Earth itself. Each face a star, each site a node in a forgotten map. Each gaze part of a larger pattern, too vast for any one culture to explain. It is tempting, almost irresistibly so, to wonder, who was this map for? Was it for us, the future, or for others? Visitors, gods, beings from the stars? Mainstream archaeology will say no. It will remind us of coincidence, of human psychology, of practical politics. And perhaps that is true. But the allure of the mystery remains, for when you stand before a Moai, when you gaze into the eyes of an Olmec head, you cannot help but feel the resonance. It is as though humanity itself was speaking across time, across oceans, across cultures, carving its eternal face into the earth to say, "We are one, we endure, we watch, we remember." So when you look into the face of a Moai, or the wide eyes of an Olmec head, or the weathered stone visages in the Andes, you are looking not just at art, but at a conversation, one that spans oceans, centuries, and civilizations. A conversation about presence, about endurance, about the human need to be remembered. And perhaps, just perhaps, a conversation about connection, a global network whose map we are only beginning to rediscover. What if these faces, scattered like constellations across the earth, were meant to speak to one another? What if the world, in ages long past, was more whole than we know, bound not by wires or satellites, but by stone, gaze, and memory? The Moai may be the most famous of these faces, but they are not alone. They are part of a global chorus, a carved humanity that still calls to us across time, inviting us to listen, to look closer, to wonder. Imagine the Moai not as silent watchers, but as transmitters, not mere statues, but instruments, monuments designed to send and receive messages across the vast silence of the Pacific, and perhaps beyond. For centuries, the people of Rapa Nui carved these towering figures from volcanic rock, dragged them across miles of land, and raised them to face the horizon. Archaeologists say they represent ancestors or symbols of authority. But what if their function was stranger, more ambitious? What if they were meant to be beacons, not only for the living, but for the skies themselves? The idea seems fantastical, but look closer. The Moai are not just heads. Beneath the earth, many have bodies buried in soil, inscribed with intricate petroglyphs. These carvings, circles, waves, patterns, are not random. Some researchers suggest that they could represent maps, calendars, or codes. To stand among the statues is to feel a geometry of placement, a sense that they were aligned not merely with the land, but with something larger. Could they have been positioned as nodes in a communication grid, their arrangement reflecting knowledge we can no longer decode? Throughout human history, communication has often involved monumentality. From smoke signals rising from hills to lighthouses, guiding sailors, from signal towers to radio antennas, height and permanence have mattered. The Moai, towering against the Pacific winds, may have served a similar role. Their very scale suggests intention, the need to be seen, to be noticed, not only by villagers nearby, but perhaps by travelers far away, even by watchers in the heavens. In a world without satellites, the people of Rapa Nui may have built their own. But what kind of communication? If we think technologically, one might imagine the statues acting as resonators. Their placement on stone platforms or ahu could have amplified sound, vibration, or even electromagnetic resonance. Some fringe theories suggest that the stone itself, tufa and basalt, could hold piezoelectric properties, converting pressure into energy. When the islanders sang or chanted at ceremonies, perhaps the vibrations moved through the statues, turning ritual into broadcast. If so, the Moai were not passive stone, but active participants in transmission. Legends from Rapa Nui speak of mana, a spiritual force that flowed through chiefs and sacred objects. The Moai were believed to embody this mana, absorbing it, radiating it outward to protect the island. To the modern ear, this may sound like mysticism, but what if mana was the people's language for a real energy, one they experienced, if not scientifically defined? Across the world, ancient cultures spoke of energies coursing through the earth, prana in India, chi in China, spirit lines among the Native Americans. The Moai may have been Easter Island's expression of the same phenomenon, energy transmission, encoded in stone. Look at their eyes. When completed, the Moai were fitted with coral and obsidian eyes, staring not blankly, but intensely. To stand before one with eyes restored is to feel the sharpness of its gaze. Could those eyes have been part of the mechanism, reflecting sunlight, moonlight, or starlight, flashing signals that carried across sea and sky? Light as communication is ancient. Polished stones and reflective surfaces were used as heliographs in many cultures. Perhaps the Moai, aligned to sunsets, solstices, or the rising of stars, once flashed like beacons in ritual synchronization. Beyond light and sound, there is silence. The placement of Moai along coastlines, facing inward, suggests guardianship, yet some face the sea, as if waiting for someone or something to arrive. Were they watching for returning canoes? Or were they part of a larger dialogue, markers along the Pacific used by voyagers as navigation beacons? Imagine sailing across open ocean, stars overhead, waves unbroken, and then seeing the silhouette of a Moai rising on the horizon. It would not only mark land, but signal belonging. You had arrived in a place where the ancestors still watched. Could the Moai have functioned like standing waveforms, their mass tuned to the rhythms of the earth? Modern science has studied how stone structures, like Stonehenge, can amplify sound and vibration, creating acoustic effects that seem otherworldly. On Rapa Nui, chanting among the Moai may have generated resonances carried by the wind, audible far away, turning ritual into transmission. The idea of sound as message, as beacon, gives the Moai a new dimension. Not watchers of silence, but makers of sound, tuned to the heartbeat of the earth. Some theorists extend this further, that the Moai were part of an intercontinental network of monuments. Easter Island is nearly equidistant from Polynesia, South America, and Antarctica, a triangulated point at the edge of the world. If monuments like Stonehenge, the pyramids, or the Andean temples were nodes in a grid, then the Moai could have been one of the most critical stations, a relay, a point of focus. Through alignments, vibrations, and energy lines, they may have participated in what some call a planetary communication system, one far older than radio, older even than writing. Skeptics dismiss these ideas and rightly point out that no physical evidence of advanced communication technology exists on Rapa Nui. But evidence can erode. Wood rots, fiber vanishes, stone remains. Perhaps what we see today is only the skeleton of a system that once was alive with movement, light, and sound. The statues, stripped of their coral eyes, toppled by time and colonization, may be ruins of a language we can no longer read. Yet, even without technology, the Moai are beacons in a more profound sense. To build them was to communicate, not just to neighbors, but to the future. Each statue declares, "We existed, we dreamed, we endured." In this way, the Moai have succeeded as communication devices. They have spoken across centuries, their voices carried not by waves or light, but by stone itself. We hear them still. But perhaps the most haunting question is this: communication with whom? If the Moai were beacons, who was on the receiving end of their messages? Some argue it was simply other humans, neighboring clans, distant voyagers, seafaring Polynesians navigating the endless Pacific. Others whisper of the stars, of celestial beings, of gods or visitors who might have passed overhead. Rapa Nui, after all, lies in isolation, as if placed deliberately in the center of a stage, an island at the edge of everything, the perfect platform for a cosmic message. In Polynesian navigation, the sea was not empty. It was a network of routes marked by stars, swells, and birds. The horizon itself was a line of information, and to place statues upon it was to join that system. The Moai may have been more than guardians of the land. They may have been participants in the language of the sea and sky. Perhaps their alignment was intentional, forming sightlines for navigators, or constellations upon the earth that mirrored those above. This would mean that the Moai were not isolated at all. They were in dialogue with the universe, part of a cartography of both ocean and heavens. Energy theorists sometimes speculate that the Moai tapped into geomagnetic forces. Rapa Nui lies near magnetic anomalies, where the Earth's field bends and fluctuates. Could the platforms have acted as conductors, the statues as amplifiers? When ceremonies filled the air with chants, drums, and firelight, perhaps the entire island became a transmitter, its voice carried not by radio waves, but by resonance with the Earth itself. To ancient minds, this would have been mana. To ours, it might be called frequency. Different languages for the same mystery, the intuition that the world itself hums, and that monuments can be tuned to its song. There are precedents elsewhere. The Great Pyramids have been studied for their acoustic properties, showing how sound resonates within chambers in ways that defy simple explanation. Stonehenge, too, has proven to amplify sound, creating a kind of ancient amphitheater. Machu Picchu's walls and temples were designed to echo the call of conch shells, turning ritual into performance across mountains. If those sites were instruments, why not the Moai? Why not Easter Island as one vast resonant body, designed to send a signal too subtle for us to hear now, but undeniable to those who once lived beneath their gaze? And yet, the greatest communication is not necessarily technical. The Moai speak in silence. They transmit meaning not through wires or waves, but through sheer endurance. They tell us that human beings, no matter how small their numbers, will strive to inscribe their presence into the cosmos. The Moai did not need to send a signal into space to succeed. They were the signal. Their very existence says, "We reached across time, across impossibility, and we left this message in stone." But consider the more unsettling possibility, that the Moai were not only sending, but also listening. Could their placement, their construction, have functioned as receivers? Stone can resonate. Arrangements of stone can act as antennas, focusing waves, absorbing subtle energies. Perhaps the Moai, with their eyes shining in coral and obsidian, were more like open eyes than closed mouths, watching, absorbing, receiving messages from sea, sky, or beyond. If so, then Rapa Nui was not just a transmitter, but a station, an ancient observatory, a listening post carved in human likeness so that the act of listening itself could become sacred. The mythic dimension is equally potent. Legends of the island speak of Hotu Matua, the first settler king, who arrived guided by dreams and visions. The ancestors were believed to communicate across generations through mana, and the statues embodied this force. If the Moai were beacons, then they did not only send messages outward, they connected the living and the dead, the past and the future. They made continuity itself into a broadcast. What is ancestry after all, but a message sent forward in time? The Moai may have been the ultimate expression of this. Ancestors carved in stone, eternally transmitting presence to descendants yet unborn. In this way, they were not only beacons of communication, but beacons of continuity, and perhaps that is their deepest truth. Even today, toppled, eroded, many buried in earth, they continue to speak. Tourists who gaze upon them feel awe, scholars argue over them, filmmakers and poets weave their mystery into art. The Moai have transmitted across centuries. They have not gone silent. Their message has only changed the medium. Where once it may have been light, sound, or mana, now it is wonder, fascination, and the haunting question, why? This is the paradox of the Moai. Whether or not they were ever literal beacons, they remain communication devices of the highest order. They force us to listen, to imagine, to wonder. They compel us to ask who we are, who we were, and who we will be. And perhaps that is the greatest transmission of all, not one sent across oceans or into the sky, but one sent into the human soul, a message that says, we are not alone, we never were, and we are all, in some way, still waiting for a reply. For every mystery that survives into our age, there are not only the forces of erosion, time, and weather, but also the hand of human silence. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, has never existed purely as an open book for archaeologists and dreamers. It has also been a closed archive, one guarded by governments, institutions, and interests that have chosen carefully what to reveal and what to bury deeper than stone. If the Moai are enigmas, it is not only because they were carved from volcanic rock centuries ago, but because layers of restriction and suppression have kept us from fully seeing them, as though the gaze of the statues themselves had been narrowed by human decree. When the first European ships anchored at the island in the 18th century, the Moai were already a mystery to outsiders. But what followed was not open exchange. It was colonization, missionary dominance, and the slow extraction of knowledge on terms not set by the islanders themselves. Oral histories that once told of the statue's construction and purpose were deliberately interrupted, dismissed as superstition, or replaced with Christian narratives. Knowledge was not merely lost with time, it was suffocated under the weight of forced silence. Even today, scholars who study Rapa Nui speak of permissions denied, excavations halted, archives locked. The Chilean government, which exercises sovereignty over the island, maintains control not only of the land, but of the very access to its history. Researchers must obtain clearance to dig, clearance to remove samples, clearance to publish findings. And more than once, those permissions have been withheld or withdrawn when results threaten to complicate the accepted story. To ask why is to tug on threads that lead beyond archaeology into the interests of tourism, national pride, and even global politics. Consider the buried bodies of the Moai. For centuries we thought them to be heads alone, gazing from the earth with enigmatic expressions. Yet early accounts from islanders themselves hinted that more lay beneath. Only when controlled excavations were finally allowed in the 20th and 21st centuries did the world learn of the torsos, the carvings etched along their stone backs, the details hidden from plain sight. Why was this revelation so late? Why were the images of full-bodied Moai not released until recently? Some whisper that the concealment was deliberate, that the full form of the statues undermined the neat tourist image of giant heads, complicating the island's brand as much as its history. Knowledge withheld, not because it was lost, but because it was inconvenient. There are also accounts of artifacts removed from Rapa Nui under the banner of science, but never returned. Skulls taken for measurement in European museums, tools and fragments locked in distant archives, sacred objects hoarded in collections where islanders could not reach them. For a people whose identity is bound to the Moai, this is not only suppression of research, it is suppression of memory. The ancestors were transmitted in stone, yet those who claimed stewardship over the island too often treated them as specimens rather than as voices. What stories could have been told had those objects remained in context? Had the people themselves held authority over their heritage? And then there are the stranger rumors. Researchers silenced after publishing unconventional findings, testimonies of magnetic anomalies near the statues, of alignments that challenged the official narrative, set aside as fringe, and denied serious funding. Local elders who speak of knowledge passed in whispers, knowledge that outsiders call myth, though it may encode memories of a time when the Moai were not merely sculptures, but parts of ceremonies we cannot reconstruct. To suppress research, after all, is not always to burn books. Sometimes it is simply to refuse to listen. Yet the pattern is not unique to Easter Island. Around the world, megalithic sites have faced the same duality of revelation and restriction. In Egypt, permissions to dig around the pyramids are tightly controlled, and theories that depart from the accepted dynastic timeline are swiftly silenced. In Turkey, excavations at Göbekli Tepe have been cautiously parceled out, revelations released slowly, as though the world must only be allowed to absorb so much at once. In Peru, stories of giants and sky visitors recorded in native traditions are quietly set aside, while the focus remains on architectural technique. The suppression of research is not only about protecting facts, it is about protecting narratives. And narratives are power. For Rapa Nui, the official narrative has long been one of tragedy and collapse. The people cut down their trees, destroyed their environment, turned to cannibalism, and degenerated into violence before Europeans arrived. It is a story often repeated in textbooks, a cautionary tale for modern civilization. But in recent decades, research has begun to suggest otherwise, that the Rapa Nui were resilient, adaptive, and capable of sustaining life even under strain, and that their true catastrophe came with foreign disease, slavery raids, and colonization. If this is so, then the myth of ecocide is not only misleading, it is itself a form of suppression, an imposed narrative that blames the victims for their suffering while absolving the colonizers who followed. The silencing is not just of archaeology, but of truth. The suppression of knowledge on Rapa Nui is not an isolated event. It is part of a long continuum in which indigenous voices are drowned out by colonial and institutional authority. Consider the missionaries who arrived in the 19th century, determined to erase the old gods and replace them with their own. They did not merely preach, they destroyed tablets of Rongorongo script, the island's only written form of communication, because they believed it carried heathen knowledge. Imagine this, a lost script, possibly encoding genealogies, histories, astronomical records, gone, burned, silenced. Was this not the most brutal form of research suppression possible? To obliterate the very medium by which a people remembered themselves. Today we stare at the surviving Rongorongo glyphs like a code we cannot crack, fragments of a library torched in the name of salvation. That silence was deliberate, and it is permanent. And yet, even in silence, whispers survive. Elders who spoke in the shadows, families who kept fragments of lore alive. But when their words did not fit the neat archaeological paradigms, they were dismissed as folklore. Oral traditions, so often discounted by Western scholars, were not treated as valid data. Here lies another layer of suppression. Not the destruction of records, but the refusal to accept those records as legitimate. What knowledge was lost because the academy, bound to its own hierarchies, decided that truth could only be measured with a ruler, a shovel, or a carbon date. The political dimension cannot be ignored. Rapa Nui is not merely an archaeological site. It is a territory governed, contested, and economically exploited. Tourism is its lifeblood, and the image of the Moai is its currency. Governments are reluctant to allow discoveries that could complicate the narrative that draws visitors. What if a chamber beneath a statue held artifacts that contradicted the current storyline? What if excavations revealed links to distant cultures that destabilize the idea of Polynesian isolation? To allow free research is to risk rewriting not only history, but identity. And identity is a fragile currency in the politics of nation-states. One cannot forget the echoes of similar patterns elsewhere. In Central America, early reports of advanced astronomy among Maya and Aztec civilizations were downplayed because they did not fit the colonial narrative of savage peoples. In North America, the remains of the so-called Kennewick man were locked away for decades amid legal battles, as though the bones themselves posed too great a risk to the accepted story of migration. In Mesopotamia, tablets that speak of celestial beings are kept in museum basements, labeled but untranslated. The pattern is global. Control the narrative, and you control the past. Control the past, and you shape the present. For Rapa Nui, this control has meant a drip feed of revelations. One decade, the announcement of buried bodies. Another, the recognition of sophisticated engineering in moving the statues upright. Each discovery framed carefully, released like pieces of a puzzle, but never allowing the full picture to emerge at once. Is this caution, or is it calculation? Are we being protected from false conclusions, or guided toward a narrative that serves certain powers? The question itself reveals the unease, that science, which should illuminate, is often dimmed by the filters of politics. And then, the existential reflection. Perhaps the greatest suppression is not only of facts, but of wonder. What if by confining the Moai to tourist brochures and narrow academic debates, we have muted their true resonance? They were not built to be curiosities or scientific specimens. They were raised as embodiments of ancestors, carriers of mana, participants in rituals we barely glimpse. To strip them of this context, to reduce them to data points, is itself a form of silencing. The Moai, who once looked upon their people as guardians, now gaze at crowds of strangers, their meaning muffled by commercialization. Is this not suppression too, subtler but equally devastating? Yet the Moai endure. They resist silence. Even with research blocked, with archives sealed, with voices dismissed, they continue to draw questions. They continue to stir something in us that escapes the boundaries of official stories. And perhaps this is the ultimate irony, that governments and institutions can restrict research, but they cannot restrict awe. The Moai continue to communicate not because of what we know about them, but because of what we do not. Their mystery itself becomes the message, transcending suppression, demanding that we look harder, think deeper, listen longer. In that way, they turn suppression on its head. For every barrier placed around them, the Moai only grow more enigmatic, more compelling. And the very act of restriction ensures that the questions survive, haunting us, reminding us that truth is never simply given. It is always sought, often against resistance. The statues carved centuries ago stand as monuments not only to their creators, but to the eternal struggle between revelation and concealment, between knowledge and power. And in their silence, they speak. Not everything you are told is all there is. Not every silence is natural. Some are imposed, and those are the ones you must question most. What if the statues of Rapa Nui are not remnants of a lost age, not relics of a silence long past, but pieces of a system that never truly ended? The Moai are carved of stone, yes, but what if stone was not the end, only the interface? A visible marker of something larger, invisible, humming beneath the crust of the earth, or above us in the ionosphere. The question is not only how the statues were made, or why, but whether the system they belong to could still be alive. Could the network still be active? Could we be living inside its web without even realizing? The first step toward answering this lies in remembering what networks really are. They are not limited to copper wires or fiber optics. Long before the internet, there were webs of communication woven into geography itself. Stone circles aligned with solstices, pyramids lined up with stars, mounds and megaliths spread across continents, each marking not only a ritual site, but a coordinate in a planetary grid. Easter Island has long been suspected of being one such node, one of the most remote points in a pattern that stretches across oceans. But the unsettling thought is this: patterns are not made for beauty alone. Patterns are instructions. A map is not only art, it is function. What if the Moai were transmitters, still performing a role we do not recognize? Scientists have measured anomalies in the ground around Rapa Nui, subtle magnetic fluctuations, unexplained variations in resonance when ultrasound scans were directed at the buried torsos. These reports are scattered, half-published, sometimes dismissed, sometimes ignored, but they echo findings at other ancient sites. The pyramids of Giza, long thought to be tombs, have been shown to resonate with particular frequencies of sound and electromagnetic waves. Stonehenge, when scanned, reveals acoustic properties that amplify voices and vibrations. Why assume the Moai are inert when every other megalithic mystery seems designed to interact with energy? Imagine for a moment that each statue is not simply watching, but broadcasting, their elongated heads angled slightly upward, their gaze fixed not on the horizon, but into the sky, as though waiting for a signal or sending one. What if their very design, the oversized craniums, the deep-set eyes, the vertical stature, was part of an encoding system? To us, they appear as faces. To someone else, perhaps, they appear as antennas. What if they still whisper across the ether? Slow pulses that we mistake for background noise? What if we are bathed in their network every day, unaware? And if this sounds like speculation, consider how many times humanity has discovered signals hidden in plain sight. Radio waves were always there, waiting for us to build receivers. The cosmic microwave background radiates around us constantly, a leftover signal from the birth of the universe. Invisible webs surround us, magnetic fields, neutrino streams, radiation belts, none of which we sensed until we built tools to decode them. Why not a network made by human hands, one that we have not yet learned to listen to? What arrogance to think that only our age could create such systems. Perhaps the Moai do not wait to be explained. Perhaps they continue to function, whether or not we understand. Legends on the island whisper of mana, the spiritual energy that flows through all living things, channeled by chiefs and ancestors, embedded in stone. Anthropologists have often described mana as metaphor, as cultural poetry. But what if mana is not merely symbolic? What if it was the local name for what we might today call a field, a current, an energy grid? The Moai, in this sense, would not be monuments, but nodes, vessels designed to gather and transmit mana. If mana is real, whether spiritual or physical, then the network may not only still exist, but still hum beneath our feet. Consider the alignments. Rapa Nui is not only marked by Moai. The island is covered in ahu platforms, carefully positioned along coastlines and ridges. When mapped, many of these form lines that point toward other sites thousands of miles away. Could it be coincidence that the island aligns geometrically with the Nazca lines, or with sites in Polynesia, or even with the great monuments of the Andes? Perhaps. But coincidence is the word we use when patterns make us uncomfortable. Networks do not advertise themselves. They hide in geometry until someone asks the forbidden question, what if it was meant? What if it still is? There are modern anomalies, too. Strange bursts of radio interference recorded near the statues. Pilots reporting instruments flickering when passing over the island. Locals telling stories of lights seen moving across the ocean horizon, always in the gaze of the Moai. These fragments are never assembled into an official narrative, but together they paint a possibility that the network is not only memory, but presence, that it may still activate in cycles, like a system waiting for alignment, a clock waiting for its hour to strike. And what of us? If the network is still alive, what role do we play? Are we participants, inheritors, or intruders in a machine built for another age? Perhaps our satellites, our global communications, our digital grids are not as new as we think. Perhaps they are echoes, unconscious reconstructions of a system older than history. When we beam signals into space, we may be doing nothing more than continuing what the Moai began, joining a choir that has been singing across time. The danger is not that the network is silent, but that it is speaking and we no longer understand the language. This leads us to the most haunting possibility. The Moai were not built for us at all. They may be terminals, waiting for receivers who are not human. Visitors from the sky, as the myths of Rapa Nui sometimes hint, beings who instructed the long-eared people, or perhaps the ancestors themselves, communicating across vast distances. If the Moai are beacons, then their audience may not yet have arrived, or may already be here, listening to a system we can neither perceive nor control. Could the network still be active? The only honest answer is, if it was ever real, then yes, because networks do not die simply because we forget them. They continue to hum, to echo, until the last node is broken. And the Moai, after all these centuries, are still standing, still watching, still transmitting their silence into a sky that may yet answer back. The possibility of an active network challenges the very way we define civilization. When archaeologists frame societies as risen or fallen, they assume that once a culture ceases to build, it ceases to function. But what if a culture can encode its continuity not in written records or cities, but in energy systems that persist beyond collapse? The Moai could then represent a civilization that never truly ended, one that continues to participate in planetary communication, whether or not its people still live by the old ways. In this sense, Rapa Nui is less a ruin and more a relay, still functioning, still linked to an architecture we cannot see. Think of the parallels. The Great Pyramid was once thought to be only a tomb, yet studies of its internal chambers reveal resonance at frequencies that could interact with the Earth's natural vibrations. In Mexico, the Pyramid of the Sun aligns with magnetic anomalies, as though drawing power from underground currents. In Gobekli Tepe, the world's oldest known temple, pillars carved with animals may have encoded cosmic cycles we are only now beginning to rediscover. Are these coincidences, or fragments of a global system? If so, then Easter Island is not an outlier but a node in an ancient internet, a web of stone instead of silicon. And like the web we use every day, once built, it never entirely goes offline. If the network is still active, what would it mean? One possibility is communication, not in words but in resonance. The Moai may be positioned to channel signals through telluric currents, invisible rivers of electricity that flow beneath the Earth's crust. Modern science has documented these currents, though their applications are rarely discussed. What if each Moai acts as an antenna, focusing this flow, amplifying it, sending it outward? The statue's eyes, once inlaid with coral, may have glowed in firelight, not only symbolically but functionally, serving as markers of activation. To the people who carved them, this was not art. It was infrastructure. The ancestors were literally watching because the network was alive. Skeptics might ask, if the system still exists, why do we not detect it with modern instruments? The answer may be simple, because we are not looking in the right way. Our instruments are designed for the frequencies of our own technologies. We listen for the chatter of satellites, for the buzz of radio, for the hum of microwaves. But what if the Moai broadcast on a scale too slow for our impatience? What if their pulses are measured not in seconds, but in centuries? What if the network's activity is timed with cosmic alignments, activating only when stars, planets, and Earth itself are positioned in harmony? In that case, our failure to detect the signal is not proof of its absence. It is proof of our short-sightedness. There is also the matter of intent. Networks are built with purpose, but their purpose may not align with our curiosity. Perhaps the Moai do not exist to communicate with us, but with the cosmos. Perhaps their gaze skyward is not metaphorical, but functional, a direct link to the heavens. If their builders were guided by visitors, as myths suggest, then the network may be tuned to frequencies of communication alien to us. In this sense, the Moai are still active, but we are not the audience. We are bystanders, walking unknowingly among transmitters humming to someone else. Yet, even this speculation underestimates the Moai, because networks do not only transmit outward, they shape inward as well. A system designed to focus energy may not only send signals, but alter the people who live within it. Rapa Nui, isolated in the Pacific, may still be shaped by the hum of its own monuments. Could this explain the persistence of cultural memory, the survival of traditions against overwhelming odds? Could the Moai's network act as a reservoir of identity, transmitting not only across space but across time, ensuring that the people of the island remain linked to their ancestors? And then comes the haunting possibility. What if the network is not passive at all, but waiting? Waiting for reactivation, for a specific trigger. Perhaps the statues were designed to endure until a moment when the cycle turns again. When humanity, or whoever the intended audience is, reaches a level of awareness needed to hear the call. We speak of the internet as if it were the first global system, but perhaps we are only rebuilding what once existed, echoing a forgotten blueprint. If so, then every email, every broadcast, every satellite signal we send into the void may be feeding a network older than history. Perhaps the Moai are not outdated, they are dormant, and our own technology is the key that will wake them. The idea may sound like myth, yet history is filled with myths that later proved to hold truth. Lightning was once explained as the anger of gods. Today we call it electricity. Disease was once seen as curse. Today we call it microbiology. What if the myth of mana, of statues that walk and speak, is another layer of truth we have not yet translated? What if the Moai really do communicate, but not in a way we yet understand? If the network is active, it may not be detectable by our machines, but by our minds, our intuitions, our dreams. How many have stood before a Moai and felt a presence, a pressure, a silence too heavy to be ordinary? Perhaps that was not imagination. Perhaps it was reception. And so we circle back to the question, could the network still be active? The answer lies not in stone, but in us. If the Moai were designed to carry messages across space and time, then those messages may still be traveling. Perhaps they are signals we will decode tomorrow. Perhaps they are signals meant for others. Perhaps we ourselves are the signals, descendants of those who once built the system, walking proof that the network succeeded in preserving a lineage across millennia. In this way, the network has never ceased. It is alive in stone, in energy, in memory, in us. And maybe this is the real revelation, that activity does not always look like noise, like flashing lights or buzzing instruments. Sometimes activity looks like silence, like endurance. The Moai endure. They have not crumbled, they have not faded. They continue to stand, their eyes fixed on horizons we cannot see. And in that endurance, the network continues. Whether or not we understand, whether or not we believe, the system is still alive, waiting, watching, transmitting. What if the Moai were not silent? What if their network, dormant but never broken, suddenly hummed back to life? What if after centuries of waiting, their purpose was fulfilled again, not in whispers or myths, but in a resonance that humanity could feel, measure, and no longer deny. The question is not only could the network still be active, but what would it mean if it reconnected? What would it mean for us, here and now, to be pulled into a web older than our civilizations? Older, perhaps, than our memory of being human? The first thing it would mean is upheaval. Imagine the shock if tomorrow, instruments across the world registered a pulse emerging from Easter Island. A low hum, consistent, global, impossible to dismiss as noise. Within hours, satellites would pick it up. Observatories would record it. News networks would erupt with speculation. A forgotten civilization, once thought to have vanished into isolation, would suddenly reveal that it had been part of something larger, something global, something we had missed. Every theory we have about human history would splinter. Evolutionary timelines, models of migration, theories of technology, all would need rewriting. We would be forced to admit that we are not the first global species, only the most recent to stumble upon the web. But beyond shock, reconnection would bring division. Governments would scramble to seize the narrative. Nations would claim ownership of the discovery. Scientists would battle over its meaning, and ordinary people would wonder what it meant for faith, for identity, for power. Would religions adapt to a network older than Scripture? Would science accept that knowledge had once been encoded in stone, not silicon? Or would both cling to their frameworks, afraid to acknowledge that something greater than either had been at play all along? And yet, in the midst of chaos, there would be wonder. Reconnection might not only be about knowledge, it might be about energy, about resonance, about a force that could transform how we live. If the Moai are nodes in a planetary circuit, then reconnection could awaken a grid that stretches across the Earth, a source of clean, limitless energy humming just beneath our feet. Think of what it would mean. No more burning of coal, no more drilling for oil, no more wars fought for resources. A civilization powered by the same network that guided the ancients. A rebirth of harmony with the planet, drawn from an inheritance we forgot we had. The Moai might not only speak to us, they might power us. But would we be ready? History warns us otherwise. Every time humanity has reconnected with a deeper force of nature, the results have been double-edged. Fire brought warmth, but also war. Electricity lit our nights, but also birthed machines of destruction. The atom split gave us energy, but also shadows of nuclear annihilation. To reconnect with an ancient network would be to awaken a force as powerful as any we have ever known. And power is never neutral. It magnifies what already exists within us, our capacity for creation, and our thirst for control. There is also the question of communication. If the Moai are transmitters, then reconnection might mean receiving messages that have been traveling for centuries, millennia, perhaps even longer. What if a signal comes through? What if the statues begin to broadcast data, voices, visions meant for us, or for someone else? How would we respond, hearing the words of ancestors long dead, or of beings who never called this earth home? Would it unite us or divide us into factions of belief and denial? To reconnect would be to confront the possibility that we are not the only ones listening, that perhaps the network has always been waiting for its audience to return. And imagine the psychological weight of such a revelation. To live knowing that the world is not random, that the placement of monuments, the alignment of stones, the echoes of myths were not accidents but instructions, parts of a design we never finished. Reconnection would mean we are inside a system larger than we ever allowed ourselves to admit. It would strip away the illusion of isolation, of control. Humanity would no longer be the author of its own story, but a character in a script that began long before us. For some, that would be liberation. For others, it would be unbearable. Yet perhaps reconnection would not come as a thunderclap, but as a whisper. Not an explosion of power, but a gradual awakening, like dawn spreading across the sky. We might begin to notice patterns in the hum of the earth, synchronicities in our lives, dreams that seem to echo across continents. Perhaps the network, once reawakened, would not shout but guide, reminding us not of something alien, but of something we once knew. Reconnection might not be a gift from outside, but a remembrance of what it means to be human, to be linked, to be part of the whole. For in the end, maybe the true power of reconnection lies not in energy or messages, but in perspective. To realize that we are not separate, that our civilizations are not islands, but nodes, that humanity itself is a network, each life a transmitter, each culture a frequency, each generation a bridge in the great web of time. The Moai, then, may be mirrors as much as monuments, reminding us of what we are, showing us the shape of our own forgotten connectivity. Reconnection would not give us something new. It would show us what we have always been. But the danger remains. To reconnect is to risk exposure. Just as a signal can be received, it can also be intercepted. If the network was once used for communication across the Earth or beyond it, then reactivating it could invite attention we do not control. Who else might be listening? Who else might be waiting for the signal to return? To reconnect might be to light a beacon in the dark, and in doing so, to reveal ourselves to watchers we cannot yet imagine. Reconnection could be humanity's greatest dawn, or its final mistake. To understand the meaning of reconnection, we must also confront our fragility. Modern humanity stands on a fragile scaffold of systems: finance, digital communication, resource supply chains that can collapse with a single disruption. If reconnection brought energy beyond measure, what would happen to the industries that profit from scarcity? Oil empires, energy conglomerates, militaries built on control of resources, each would see their foundations shaken. Reconnection would not be a scientific discovery alone. It would be a political earthquake. Wars have been fought for less. Would nations cooperate to share the gift of the network, or would they wage new battles to seize it for themselves? History suggests the latter. And yet, history also suggests that crises have a way of forcing us into unity. Reconnection might compel us, for the first time, to act as one species instead of fractured states. And then there is the individual. Imagine standing before a Moai as the network reawakens, the ground vibrating softly, the air charged, a sensation that your heartbeat is not yours alone, but synchronized with something larger. What would that do to the human psyche? For some, it would be overwhelming, a dissolution of boundaries too frightening to endure. For others, it would be transcendence, the awakening of a long-suppressed memory of belonging. Mystics across cultures have described union with the cosmos, loss of self into the great whole. Reconnection might universalize that experience, turning every human into a mystic, whether willing or not. Would our world survive such a transformation? Or would individuality, the cornerstone of modern life, fracture under the weight of collective resonance? We might look to myths for guidance. The Tower of Babel tells of a humanity once united, speaking one language, until the gods scattered us in fear of our power. Could reconnection be the return of that lost unity, a rejoining of voices once silenced? Or would it repeat the same tragedy, a brief harmony followed by catastrophic division? Ancient myths may not be memories of the past alone. They may be warnings encoded for us to understand when the cycle turns again. There is also a cosmic dimension. If reconnection transmits signals beyond Earth, then humanity would become visible on the galactic stage in a way it has never been before. For centuries, we have broadcast unintentionally. Our radio, our television, our probes drifting into the void. But to reconnect an ancient system would be to speak in a tongue not of our making, one already understood by those who may have seeded it. Would they answer? Would they arrive? Or are they already here, waiting for us to prove that we can rejoin the conversation? The idea that the Moai are beacons for sky visitors may be more than myth. It may be an instruction manual we have yet to translate. And what of time itself? If the network spans not only distance but epochs, then reconnection could open doors not only outward but backward. What if the Moai carry not signals for others, but signals for us, preserved across time? Data encoded in resonance, waiting for humanity at this precise stage of development. In that case, reconnection would not only link us to the stars, but to our ancestors, voices whispering across millennia, ensuring that the knowledge of their world did not vanish. We would not only inherit history, we would experience it directly, as if the past itself had never gone silent. Yet for all these possibilities, one truth remains constant. Reconnection would erase the illusion of isolation. For centuries, we have imagined ourselves alone, alone in the universe, alone in history, alone on our islands of culture and identity. But reconnection would reveal that we are woven into a web that defies isolation, that we have always been connected, even when we forgot, that our separation was never truth, only blindness. Such a revelation could heal us, or undo us. It would demand humility, and humanity is not skilled at humility. And still, Perhaps that is the point. Perhaps reconnection would not come to offer us power or knowledge, but to remind us of our place, to remind us that we are not masters of the earth, but children of it, that our monuments of glass and steel are but echoes of the stone giants who have stood for centuries, patient, enduring, waiting. To reconnect would be to kneel before time itself, to acknowledge that our species is young, our arrogance thin, our survival uncertain. It would be to learn, finally, that greatness lies not in conquest, but in connection. So what would reconnection mean? It would mean endings and beginnings, the end of illusions, the beginning of truth, the end of isolation, the beginning of unity, the end of fear, the beginning of awe. It would mean that we are not the first to dream of a network, nor will we be the last. It would mean that the Moai have fulfilled their purpose, not as silent relics, but as voices in the great chorus of the earth, a chorus we are only now beginning to hear. Reconnection would mean that humanity's story is not its own, but part of a larger song, sung across stone and star alike. And maybe that is why they endure, because the statues know that one day when the noise of our machines fades, when the clamor of our wars subsides, when the illusions of power collapse, we will finally hear it, the hum of the network, the whisper of reconnection. And in that moment, we will not ask whether we are ready. We will only realize that it has been waiting for us all along,